Hello, something guys and gals. This is Something Guy 912. Well, if third time's a charm, fourth time would be a lucky clover. Lucky for you, however, because while you get to sit back and enjoy the three-course meal of this video, I have to prepare it through the arduous process of slaughtering the respective awfulness of the Borderlands series and make something presentable for those would-be watchers. And seeing as chronologically through the Borderlands series we have left at a really sour note with Borderlands 3, fine to throw away the concept of internal consistency with not only itself but with the prior titles while dancing on its grave, it's no surprise that with the next entree into the Borderlands series that any pretense of giving a shit about the cohesion of the story should be forgotten, as it's all within the imagination of a 14-year-old. Call me a cynic, but I find the decision to have Wonderlands be set as a elongated, fully realized title of the Assault on Dragon Keep DLC from Borderlands 2 a deliberate move to not only distance itself away from trying to piece together the puke souffle of Borderlands 3's world building, but also to make any writing, shit or not, inconsequential because, well, in their universe it's completely fictional. Maybe I was a bit too naive in thinking the writers would try desperately to weave the war-torn ribbons of what BL3 left in its wake, and should have realized that like with Borderlands 3 having treated its respective characters and stories as merely a inconvenience to their vision, that same sentiment would carry into Wonderlands itself. Now, with all of that being said, you would imagine that my feelings towards Wonderlands, as a story,
He said it! He said it!
would somehow dwarf the frustrations I expressed in trudging through BL3's retroactive, cringy, and frankly tepid writing, but I'm merely expressing my own loss of engagement with the ongoing continuity with the Borderlands series, as well as my disdain with the direction the writers have made to take the story out back like old Yeller. Wonderlands, as far as a story outside of the fictional universe of Tiny Tina's D&D campaign and within as a meta-commentary on the nature of choice and predeterminism goes, is leagues better than Borderlands 3. Although, preemptively I can only say this because the stakes of Wonderlands are severely dwarfed in comparison to the universe-damning aspects of Borderlands 3, and still smaller than the stakes of Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel. So I have to wonder if any praise of the story is only by coincidence that the writers didn't have much in the way to butcher in regards to the characters that we do get to know of in and out of this D&D interaction. Nevertheless, it's too soon to tell, and you'll likely know all my feelings once we embark upon the Wonderlands story like we've done countless times before. So take it away, note taker?
Beyond the Borderlands. A world forged by wonder and ruled by fate. The battle between these powers has raged since the beginning. Evil and good. Villains and heroes. A vicious cycle, endlessly repeated. Wonder is the power of a cruel, unpredictable god. But fate, there's one alone who can wield fate. One alone whose story is in their own hands. The Fatebreaker. That's you. Heavy, right? Fatebreaker. Big responsibility. Honestly, I wouldn't even blame you if you just laid down in a puddle and gave up. But if not, if you try and prove yourself as Fatebreaker, then heed the warning I give all heroes. Together you fight. Together you shall fall.
Before we let the cutscene play out right after the usual monologue, we have to discuss a bit about the monologue played before us. It's basically your run-of-the-mill hero's journey archetype you've doubtless heard plenty of times in a D&D setting, which with it comes the expectation that this story is going to be largely cut and dry in terms of its payoffs, which doesn't exactly bode well for the story of these respective Borderlands titles to improve, not to mention how even in the goddamn monologue they can't help but make a joke at the expense of the story they are trying to tell you. I saw a comment regarding my criticism of the humor that feels the need to shove itself above the priority list to the story when I made the pre-sequel vid, and with that feel compelled to explain to you all why I harp on the humor of the story much. Especially with this game, as I feel it has taken its direction with humor in a way that only Yahtzee Croshaw could describe.
The patented Borderlands method, a simple 3-step process that will turn any dry functional dialogue line into gut-busting hilarity. Step 1, say the thing. Step 2, keep talking like you're a socially inept partygoer who's just had his first line of coke. Step 3, transition into some kind of embarrassed tangent to reflect a level of self-awareness otherwise largely absent from the work. Let's see it in action. Go through that door becomes go through that door because there's probably treasure on the other side. And by treasure I mean more hideous violence against strangers, which is treasure to me. My doctor says I should get out more. Now was that funny or what? No, it wasn't, not in the least.
Basically, the humor insists upon itself. So much so that a large portion of the dialogue present in this game isn't much in the way of excavating these characters so much as delivery for another hilarious punchline, and often does so at the expense of whatever narrative throughline we would experience likewise, like in the pre-sequel where a revelation about a character's immoral decision is cast away to make some analogy about her breast size being equivalent to her deceitfulness, or in Borderlands 3 where a eulogy for a character is delivered by someone who only knows the word emotion on a dictionary. And that is further vindicated with the follow-up cutscene, where the writers feel the need to point out the absurdity of the player character's lack of hue in their figurine, something deliberately arbitrated by the developer so as not to purposefully distinguish what a role-playing game character is. Anyhow, you and the character go and face off against the Dragon Lord, who is going to be the central antagonist in 2 different respects. What do I mean by this? Well, I just can't spoil the beans when we've not even stepped our door into this story. Fighting alongside you are the only 2 new characters outside of the D&D campaign, and boy is that something I'm going to have to say a lot. Fret and Valentine, who will later explain that they are playing this because their ship was apparently marooned and had nothing better to do but to pass the time playing the game with Tiny Tina, the Bunker Master. Wait, is that politically incorrect to say now? Who narrates your predictable defeat against the Dragon Lord and his inevitable defeat at the hands of Queen Butt Stallion with a sword known as the Sword of Souls or Fatebreaker once you get it yourself. I feel like the latter term is a bit of a spoiler for a story bit later down the line, but if you aren't familiar with the story, you won't have a clue its significance. After Butt Stallion defeats the Dragon Lord, Tiny Tina wants you and the gang to start off on a new slate as a result of you, as I'm going to refer to as newbie instead of player character for my own benefit, is fresh meat in the Bunkers and Badasses experience. Perhaps the most drastic change that Wonderlands can afford beyond the change of scenery is the fact that you, the player character, exist and are an active participant in the world of Borderlands in and out of this D&D experience. Whereas prior you would choose a pre-made character and experience the story vicariously through them, here you make your own character to play into the roleplay mechanics delivered. I have mixed opinions about this change. See, the problem with this is that your existence and why you are here, playing this game with Tiny Tina and the duo, is largely up to your own interpretation, but even so, your involvement in said world is extremely superficial at best. You don't even see a visage of your Borderlands counterpart with the character you make in the D&D game, as though Tiny Tina and the gang are talking to a mere specter of a person rather than someone who feels as though they have their own autonomy beyond just playing some dice and figurines. But the more pressing issue with this change is that now, any dialogue that the newbies share as the events unfold will come with it the dissonance of the person who's playing it. What do I mean by this? Let's take Fallout 4 as a good example of this choice. The main issue with making the protagonist of Fallout 4 fully voiced is that often what they will say won't reflect what the person making the decision is thinking. This was also in large part to how Bethesda thought that a 1 or 2 word summary of a whole sentence was enough to elucidate what the protagonist would say, which leads into situations like this.
Hope you got what you were looking for inside my head. I was right. I should have killed you when you were on ice.
You wanna try for round 2? Let's go!
What?
Obviously, when it comes to video games, and even RPGs, there won't always be the most varied of dialogue choices present to the player. but at least in those situations, you are making the conscious decision knowing exactly what the character is going to say. Whereas in this case, and as it will become present in Wonderlands, in spite of presenting itself as an RPG, it doesn't quite earn that reputation and betrays your sentiments as the plot unfolds. As a point of comparison, this whole dissonance could have been avoided if the person in question was just another NPC who you were assuming the role of, while still having the mechanics to fully tool out your character. Similarly to how the Assault on Dragon Keep DLC had the suspension of disbelief of you playing as one of the Vault Hunters playing the D&D campaign as the Borderlands 2 Vault Hunters inside of said campaign. Even in Wonderlands, they don't even use that conceit, as after you and the rest make your character sheets, Tiny Tina finds that Fret and Valentine failed the basic requirement to do so and just become advisors to your single-player campaign, which also causes the problem of how you even square away the co-op aspects of the game if we are to assume you're the only one who is playing this campaign, as the other two merely spectate? Yes, I'm well aware of the fact that I've belabored what would normally be a largely inconsequential part of the game's story, but when the game has to contrive this setup to even happen in the first place, while Tiny Tina further embodies this trapped circumstance by saying that you can't ever break character, illustrates how little conveyance there is for all the pieces to unfold. And speaking of unfolding, seeing as this game does take place yet again in an indeterminate time after Borderlands 2 but before Borderlands 3, shows the secondhand embarrassment of even trying to make sense of the relative continuity of this world that yes, it would behoove of someone to play pretend within a pretend universe. So with that, we prattle on the pretense with the character sheet that has the most customization options for your character available to you yet. And hey, you can even choose the preferred pronouns of your character, which I'm sure will appeal to the 1% of the 0.6% of people who even play this game. You know, speaking of those pronouns, doesn't having a they-them choice actively contradict the notion that transgender people want to transition to the sex they feel more comfortable with? What am I saying? Supposedly I'm the transphobe here for pointing that out rather than the one who put that in to begin with. But regardless, I highly doubt that this even has a factor into the dialogue, as regardless of choice, everyone will either refer to you as newbie, Fatemaker, or they, so as, again, not to blatantly contradict your RPG choices. You re-enter into the campaign as Tiny Tina gives you the basic story bit. You're out looking for the Dragon Lord as Butt Stallion fears that someone, or something, is attempting to waken him from his confines. There's these waystones that are padded throughout that will inevitably phase out of the broader scope of the world, as this is more or less a way to tutorialize to you the mechanics, which, hey, is leagues better than having Claptrap do it now, isn't it? Another major conceit this game has to make, despite trying to be more fantasy themed, is the existence of crossbolt and normal projectile guns in lieu of the whole assembly of melee and spell-oriented weapons available to you. I guess you can suppose this as a way not to completely alienate the fanbase from the familiar, but still, for as much as this game sells you on the concept, it doesn't quite commit to it, as further evidence will show the farther we get in. As you proceed through the tutorial section, you encounter the first boss of the game, Ribula, who's a loyal servant of the Dragon Lord seeking to awaken him. With skeletons being the standard archetype of the D&D fantasy, most of the skeletons presented in this game either try to sound like Skeletor or just go for the excitedly gravelly bent. I suppose a lot of what this game calls charm is leaning into the stereotypes presented in D&D settings while mocking it, writing an extremely fine line between satire and appeasement. Although, writing an extremely fine line is being a bit generous given that it often literally teeters on one side or the other, often to its own detriment. But, as far as tutorial bosses go, however, he is a much better entry than Scav was in Borderlands 3, mainly because of how much more of an assortment of items and weapons you have at your disposal in comparison to him as a result. As you go through a village ravaged by Ribula and go down the tomb, you'll as usual encounter some scroll logs and other collectible items, as per the vernacular when it comes to the Borderlands series. Compared to other logs present, they don't really envision a more realized world, but feel like an excuse to write out more humor if the humor you've already been force-fed thus far wasn't quite to your liking, which makes even grabbing them its own detriment despite my, or your, monkey brain insisting that we must collect it. Despite how worthless the dialogue that Fret and Valentine have been puking at present, Valentine says to Tina that he eventually wants to be Bunker Master as well, and asks if she would be interested in playing in his campaign, which she immediately stamps down with a no. Normally, you would assume she's more interested in making the campaigns rather than playing them, but there is in fact a lot more to dig from her response once we know truly why. After defeating Ribula, once you go through the procession, as the archetype goes, you were just a moment too late to stop the Dragon Lord from freeing himself as you try to challenge him before he denies such, and gives a bit of an ominous line that goes,
You're stronger than the ones she said before. I wonder.
This is one facet of many present throughout of this character, despite existing solely within the mind of Tiny Tina, having more sentience beyond what we normally would assume of them. And better yet, it's not even played like a joke, unlike a certain other character later down the story. Although even if I were to give praise to this also does raise a big query about how much is this Tiny Tina's doing, your conceptualization of Dragon Lord, and of Dragon Lord's own independence from such subliminal suggestion. What exactly Dragon Lord means when he wonders about your strength will just get elaborated later on, but before I do, can I just say it's refreshing to have a character that isn't just so blatantly black and white on their morality for a change? The tutorial section ends with a note spoken by the note taker, whose voice is one that you haven't heard in a while, but it's familiar all the same. Who am I referring to? Well, you know me well by now that I save all my shocking revelations near the end, but regardless, he imparts some wisdom of the destiny guided by the Fatebreaker before Valentine catches wind of the Dragon Lord's euphemisms and figures he's going to try to kill Butt Stallion, so we have to journey across the Wonderlands to Brighthoof to warn her of the impending danger. Starting off with Chapter 2, we are introduced to the overworld present in Wonderlands, and the title card, as technically this is the first chapter, whereas the Bunkers and Badasses chapter was mostly a prologue for the game's narrative to kick off. Regardless, the chapters are not titled as such, so I'm not going to confuse you as to where we are at. But what of that overworld? I do remember the decision to make the open world aspect of Wonderlands be relegated this way contentious for many, but honestly, the open world aspect of the prior Borderlands titles felt like mostly padding to the next story bit, or for side quests to be riddled aplenty. At least when it came to fighting mobs and vehicles anyway. At least here, the only time wasted is the walking, warping between zones, and the random enemy encounters you can opt out of if you're quick enough. I guess that is one jarring thing about this game, that it would so blatantly treat the main feature of all the Borderlands titles like a nuisance rather than an opportunity, as often the rewards you get in these encounters are fairly lax and more so only foreshadow what the endgame features provides. Which goes to show how quickly this game lapsed from the public consciousness, even more so than Borderlands 3 did once the honeymoon period ended. But we're not here to discuss the gameplay aspects of Wonderlands, we're here to discuss the story. And of course the side quests when present, and seeing as how the dialogue facilitated in the main story so far is quipping and Tiny Tina's euphemisms espoused errantly, then the side quests would be even more than that. The first one you can even encounter with is Knife to Meet You, which the entire joke that they ran into the Marianas Trench far sooner than the joke could ever have been funny to begin with is that the NPC you talk to is totally going to backstab you, and that his name is Bok Staub. Of course, one would counter by saying that he's just here to present to you the shrines in which, if you collect the pieces, give awards to the players, benefits present in and out of the overworld, but I say that's not a really good excuse to lay the already poor joke this thick like we hadn't seen it coming that far away. And frankly, a lot of the side quests are just like this, and their degree of toleration is all dependent on how long it takes you to complete it, which makes this one quite tame by comparison to certain other ones. Back to the main story, the only smidgen of the outside world that we do understand, at least as Tina can best describe it, is that she's been presumably stuck in the cave of which you are playing this D&D campaign alone and was thankful that you, Valentine, and Fret are there to give her some company. Why she was stuck in this cave when, as far as we know, was with the Crimson Raiders after the destruction of Sanctuary and likely would have been watched over at least by Brick and Mordecai is yet again saved for the next writer to fill in, because even in the interest of justifying us playing this D&D campaign with two people who only exist to give their respective voice actors a paycheck, couldn't help themselves to contrive the circumstances we're in. As you near closer to Brighthoof, Dragonlord starts to do clipping of his own, some of which implying yet again that he's more aware of this campaign being, well, a D&D campaign, and says something to the effect of, "You don't need luck, you're a fate maker," which seems to also imply that he knows full well exactly how your story will be told. As interesting as all of that may be, it does start to reek a bit of poking fun at their own fourth wall humor by way of making the antagonist really lean in on the villain trope, like he does when he lays an assault on Brighthoof in an attempt to kill Butt Stallion. Like, am I to assume that he's just hamming up the performance to sell his character as being evil, or just as another lame way to insert humor into the story like a syringe to a coke fiend? But hey, I guess me not being certain of his motives is leagues better than being as unambiguously and laughably villainous as Tyrene Calypso was, so we take our wins when we can get them. As the assault goes on, you encounter one of the first friendly NPCs that you've encountered thus far, and one that may be familiar if you notice their similarities. Paladin Mike is the name, who sports a pretty gaudy outfit, even by this game's standards, a dirty British accent, and most importantly, a fondness for coffee. If those aren't ample comparisons to make for you, even Tiny Tina spells it out that it's none other than Lorelei, at least the D&D character Tiny Tina got from her via the EchoNet, presumably. Another pattern that this game takes is that it transmutes some of the characters from Borderlands 3 into these Wonderlands counterparts, as we'll come across a likeness of Genevieve and a likeness of Clay later down, and while yes, the Assault on Dragon Keep DLC did that as well, the difference there was that the characters like Ellie were made present with all of their characteristics intact, put into this fantasy world, rather than having their characteristics slightly altered to mold into the fantasy world a bit better. Furthermore, while Tiny Tina justifies the existence of the Lorelei lookalike, she couldn't be possibly aware of the existence of Clay or Genevieve during the events of this story, nor even during the events of Borderlands 3, seeing as that game chose to make her largely inconsequential in them for her to assert them into this fantasy setting. Going on the major changes, one major characteristic that is different from Paladin Mike to Lorelei is their gender, despite having literally the same voice actor for the role, and while normally I'd assume that this was done as to show the roleplay aspect of this campaign, new tales from the Borderlands unfortunately came out before this video to completely change the context as to why Paladin Mike is a man now, which, given how little significance Lorelei was to the plot of Borderlands 3 and how bland she was as a character, are the writers this desperate to think making her trans is a substitute for having not much of a character to begin with? It's not like Lorelei, or I guess Lore, has anything more to do in the plot revolving new tales, but I've got years of my life to live before I waste them on that other horseshit of a story too. So regardless, Paladin Mike suits the same plot thread that Lorelei did in Borderlands 3, aiding you in stopping the Bony Man assault by way of destroying the catapults via Fantasy 4, as again, the writers find themselves thinking being aware of their own contrivance of explosives in this universe means it can get away with any contrivance present. Like, if even the characters that you write have to explicitly point out how contrived you wrote the circumstance to be this way, how are we supposed to take anything going on in the campaign seriously? But who knows, maybe that's the great meta-narrative we're parsing here, but we've yet more story for me to comb through before I really tackle if this story even achieved such a thing. To really accentuate just how bottom of the barrel the joke onslaught can get, once you do clear out the skeleton assault, I shit you not, the writers literally recycle an already bad joke from Borderlands 3, basically line for line, regarding Paladin Mike being asked the password to open the gates of Brighthoof, as a parallel to Lorelei being asked the password to get inside Atlas's little holdout.
Speak the password?
Passwords, open the bloody gate before a club leaves down your throat, stick a handle on your ass, and turn you into my own personal bloody teapot!
It's definitely him, guys! Open the gate!
Oi, Skyman! Open up! Passwords, open the bloody door before I shove a coffee grinder up your ass.
Once inside, considering how much Dragonlord has hammed up him assaulting Brighthoof, it got me to wonder if he was doing this as a complete diversion from what he was actually after, similarly to the circumstance involving the train heist in Borderlands 2. At least there, it would explain how nonplussed he is after you do stop it, other than his line about how he's done just merely playing along with the charade. But that also means that his assault was meaningless, as of course you would naturally want to stop him killing the queen, and he would know that too given his other lines about somewhat being aware of the circumstances of the story being played out. And again, are the lines that he hands up lines that Tiny Tina is reciting, or are all the lines being recited by her? Where is the line between when her influence on the campaign has an effect on him? This will all be extremely important once the major spoiler is revealed, but it's questions like that that get my mind boggling about how much of this is even real, even within the imagination of the player character. Now, with all my loathing about the humor in this story being noted, there is several that are quite funny, perhaps just by principle of their absurdity. So there's a drawbridge that is stopping us from getting to the main courtyard, and Valentine gets the wacky idea that we have to seduce the drawbridge to let us across, and it works. I don't have much to say than just how silly the idea that was the solution to our conundrum, because honestly, I thought what the joke was going to be was that Valentine was so stupid to think doing something like that would work, and that the humor was how much of an idiot we, the writers, wrote him to be. Once you've finally cleared out the undead hordes, Dragonlord espouses the ominous line I mentioned earlier about not wanting to play by the rules anymore, whatever that means in this campaign, and now we must have an address with the one Queen Butt Stallion to figure out how to deal with said troublemaker. And so, starting off Chapter 3, we are introduced to Queen Butt Stallion. For the second time, despite how the cutscene for her character and our player character being elated at seeing her would imply, seeing as the intro cutscene already had her single-handedly deal with Dragonlord herself. If you notice so far, there isn't too much for me to say about the cutscenes in question, since so far have been relegated to the monologue at the start and the character slide thing prevalent in the Borderlands series, which is because there strictly hasn't been one yet, at least for the campaign that we are doing right now. But there will be one coming up near the end of the chapter that will be quite important in saying about the rest of the story forward, with its own hang-ups and positives to offer, considering that its competition with the last game is almost giving this game an obligatory award for its cutscenes not sucking ass so far. Anyhow, with Butt Stallion's nays, translated by Tiny Tina for our sake, despite our bravery and camaraderie thus far, in order to permanently end the reign of Dragonlord, we have to seek the Sword of Souls that she used prior to defeat him in the monologue campaign. Why the sword wasn't already with Butt Stallion in case of a situation like this is explained by Tiny Tina, that the sword was left in Shattergrave Barrow in case the undead would rise again, as the sword is powered by soul energy and can absorb those living or otherwise. Fret asks a compelling question to Tina that if this sword could supposedly do such a thing, why not absorb the soul of Dragonlord and be done with it? Tina gives a pretty milquetoast answer while Valentine apes her sentiments, although with her saying, "He's bad, but not that bad," is again some important subtext we'll be able to get to for however long it takes me to get to that scene in question near the end of the game. Regardless, I do find Tina's justification that, "Do you not want to fight the Dragonlord?" a pretty poor reason if we are to believe that the Sword of Souls has this kind of capability, when we could just argue that the Dragonlord doesn't have a soul of his own and that he powers himself through the weird quartz. That becomes more apparent once we close on his domain. But again, that would be my reasoning why the uber powerful sword doesn't work on Dragonlord but can cripple him considerably, not anything that the writers put in, and this blithering witlessness espoused by both Tina and Valentine, his dialogue is especially grueling to get through in spite of who's voicing him, is just used again as an opportunity to make a joke at Fret's expense and the story's expense. Regardless, we press on. We come across the counterpart to Genevieve that I mentioned last chapter, named Zomboss, who carries the unique distinction of being able to transfer her soul to other bodies, which is also played up as a joke to her possessive attitude. Again, it may not be obvious that it's supposed to be a Wonderlands variant, but with her referring to the player character as "cutie idiot," like she did to the Vault Hunter and Balex while we were navigating bitches, and the family jewel is more than apparent the distinction. Now, like I said last chapter, I do have mixed feelings about making like counterparts to characters from Borderlands 3, but if this was held consistently, then I wouldn't mind, but there will be a character present in the next chapter that actively contradicts this notion of transmuting some of the characteristics of these characters for the sake of the D&D world. What I find incredibly ironic about the joke being made about Zomboss to the spectators in question is that she both won't die and won't shut up, which is something I feel I could say quite sternly about both Valentine and Fred so far in this campaign, considering how about 90% of their dialogue has been worthless thus far. Still, I do admit that the dialogue with Zomboss isn't really that compelling, with her being an equivalent to Genevieve, wanting to go on a chase to fetch the Sword of Souls for Dragonlord to get a better position in Unlife, just like with her AI wanting to be put on a Dreadnought if she fetched the Vault Key fragment for the Calypsos. What's funny about this equivalence is that here it avoids the problem of why Genevieve never gave the Calypsos that key fragment if she had it in her possession and the means to move it, nor why the Calypsos themselves didn't teleport there to take it for themselves, as Zomboss doesn't have possession of the sword nor its direct whereabouts, only having an idea that it's in Shadowgrave Barrow. Although with Dragonlord's absence, and with Zomboss stating that she was doing this on behalf of him, I wonder what exactly Dragonlord wanted to accomplish from that skeleton onslaught, unless now he intends to take the sword himself as a means to break the rules after its failure, but it's hell of a less of a headache to consider than whatever reasoning went behind the Calypso's minds. We find ourselves in a roadblock on the way to fetching the sword. In order to get into the relic repository, we have to find the Book of Fate and read the decree aloud in order to enter it, without the help of Buttstallion, of course, because she's still all in all guiding us to it this whole way, but only coming in on occasion to help out a fight to show how powerful she is. This is another contrivance I always never sat well with when any game does it, that a powerful NPC is following you along but choosing selectively when to engage, like how in Borderlands 3, Zero has you go kill Gigamind on your own despite him getting direct orders from Reese to kill Gigamind to get the military plans of Mollywan's takeover, or in other games like Diablo 3 where a powerful angel comes in to board wipe a horde of demons only on occasion. Like, I understand this is done in order to not make the fight utterly trivial, but it also causes a case of ludonarrative dissonance where a presumably powerful ally will just let you die out of sheer apathy of it all. In fact, considering that Brighthoof was just recently sacked by Dragonlord's forces, it would make more sense for Buttstallion to point us in the right direction while she guards Brighthoof, in the off chance that he doesn't try to sack it again. Or better yet, if we are to assume that Buttstallion is so powerful, where the hell was she during the goings-on of that assault? Is she just a diamond pony or not? Rules like this need to be consistent, even in a world where they can throw consistency out of the window for the sake of a fucking joke, or else I, and likely many others, will find the story only made by committee than anything else. Regardless, we have to get said tome from one of the classic D&D foibles, the Mimic, for which to never be seen again. At least as far as I played it. Maybe there was one other instance that a Mimic appeared, but compared to how frequent they appeared in the Assault on Dragon Keep DLC, it almost seems a mistake they didn't show up in chests throughout the world. And once we go back to the pedestal to read said tome, which gives us one of the more notable lines spoken by the Fatemaker.
Fate does not divide us. Fate brings us together.
It's a line that is in all respects mocked, praised, and made to explore one of the more notable themes of this game, the idea of predeterminism. Seeing as the procession of this campaign is dictated solely by Tina and that we are merely along for the ride, it does start to paint certain parallels to another game that I can never ever stop speaking the praises of, BioShock. In that, you were assumed to be doing everything of your own volition, until it is revealed that you are being compelled subliminally using the key phrase, "Would you kindly?" for someone else's own ends. While Wonderlands doesn't accomplish the narrative tact necessary to go about challenging our own conceptions of free will, it does so much better through Dragonlord himself. But insofar as making his usual quips, his attitudes towards Tina will become much more personal and direct rather than passive. I described him at one point as feeling as though a misbegotten toy who's tired of being shoehorned into the same catch-all, which is all the more interesting how he almost takes offense to the idea that Tiny Tina would suggest that he's not that bad, knowing how often she's fated him to be the bad guy. In a way, fate brought him to be this way despite how he almost resents the position given. But we'll get to explore what Dragonlord truly meant to Tina soon enough. I don't want to deliberate on his character too much. After the waffling, we go into the repository, kill the ensemble of zombie, skeleton, and troll, and fight the zombie boss for the umpteenth time in order to retrieve the Sword of Souls. To demonstrate its potential, seeing the zombie boss is still alive and bickering at us, we use it to absorb her soul into it, but before you do, just to demonstrate how the dialogue feels as though it's trying to fill dead air for jokes, here's the entire extent of what she can say if you even bother to let her.
Give me that sword! It's not even yours! It was the Dragon Lord's to begin with. You're just stealing from a guy because he's evil, and that's more evil when you think about it. Yeah! Give me the sword! Give me! Come on! Oh! I'm gonna haunt you! You are so haunted, cutie idiot! I'm gonna live in your house, and I'm gonna possess you while you're sleeping and drink all your soda unless you give me the sword! I want that sword!
After ridding of Zomboss, a town portal back to Brighthoof is made for our convenience, yet never again for some reason, so that you can place the sword into a sheath at the main square, which repairs the damage done to the town by the onslaught. After that, you get further tutorialized into what will become your main hub for storing gear, customizing your character, and so on and so forth. Why I'm so quick to skim over this is both that all of this should be familiar to any Borderlands player by now, and that this is to get to the juicy part of this chapter. After all the good deeds you've done for the town, Paladin Mike tells you that the Queen wants to personally knight you for your efforts, so you head back to the main square, and what happens next is certainly interesting. It's also the first cutscene for this entire campaign thus far, and seeing how I've done covering cutscenes, I'll describe what happens, and then we can discuss what it does right and wrong in the interim. Before I can even do that, however, one thing that is noticeably different compared to Borderlands 3 is that the cutscene in question plays out in your POV, which means whatever happens in said cutscene can actually take into account your presence, unlike how Borderlands 3's cutscenes contrive the non-existence of our player characters in order for the event to play out, and only the cutscene with Troy Calypso was ever done in our perspective, and the first cutscene with Lilith fighting the Calypsos did it justify our non-intervention in it. With that, let's dig into this cutscene. So you walk over to Paladin Mike and Bud Stallion, where the former proceeds to commemorate your efforts thus far, and you proceed to kneel to be knighted by the latter. Before that can happen, unfortunately, Dragon Lord butts in and proceeds to take the Sword of Souls, restrain Paladin Mike, and catch Bud Stallion at a cut above the collar while she rears in defense. Before you and Paladin Mike can even do anything, Dragon Lord blows both of you back a ways before expressing his frustrations of how his story has been played out, and intends to rid the master of this campaign's world entirely. And unlike the Calypsos, he doesn't even need to explain how or even why, and leaves us with a newly decapitated Bud Stallion to reminisce. As for the spectators in question, Valentine expresses shock that Tiny Tina would even go so far as to do this, before she says that it wasn't even supposed to happen, and the Dragon Lord exclaims that now he has control over how this story goes. So to start, again, I find it odd that Dragon Lord's intention to lay a siege on Brighthoof feels almost a diversion to his real plans to use the Sword of Souls to kill Bud Stallion in a single glancing blow. But alas, I'm not sure if this was his plan after the failure of the siege, so I can give this a slight pass. As for the killing itself, I really like how the writers actually commit to the death, at least until the end of the story. Unlike in Borderlands 3, how Lilith's survival at the hands of the Calypsos was only done to do one of the most nonsensical things in all of Borderlands' respective continuity, though with New Tales maybe it finally has some competition, while she was practically non-existent for the rest of the story. As for your perspective, like with Handsome Jack killing Roland, there isn't enough time for you to even react in a way that would amount to anything, and Dragon Lord splits no hairs in getting across why he did it and what he intends to do, but even having him stagger you that far also does a good job of recognizing your existence in this world had there been precedent to account for such a thing. Although after the praises comes the daunting questions. So, as far as we're concerned, everything that is happening, will happen, and has happened are all visualized in our mind by however Tiny Tina recites it. So, I don't really buy that she says, this wasn't supposed to happen, when that would mean that the D&D game is more of a board game, and Dragon Lord is a figurine that has come to life inexplicably through it to have a will of his own. Otherwise, the only other conceits I can make of this happening is that Tiny Tina had a sudden mental break that caused her to shift the story in this direction, because that's honestly the only way that makes sense that she would rationalize this as not being intended for the story, and for Dragon Lord to subvert it that way. But if I were to further bring up how much of a connection Dragonlord has to Tiny Tina in order to justify how this could make sense, would blow a keg into a major spoiler down the line that I want to address all the nuances regarding what happens between them. Regardless, this was quite a rejuvenating experience to see first time, because at this point, the dialogue to me felt like utter white noise, while the gameplay was barely a means to an end, and the story was utterly stale and by the numbers up until this complete subversion almost shocked me back to certain consciousness. Will the rest of the story be able to hold my attention quite like this cutscene did? Only in the next chapter will we know. After Butt Stallion's untimely death, we're given another monologue by the note-taker, whose message auspiciously accounts for the possibility of said character dying, while Tiny Tina tries to get the narrative, or more importantly, her narrative, back on track. We hear a loud boom and investigate the noise as we bear witness to Dragonlord's pyramid, a fortress of his and a conduit for the Sword of Souls, which would allow him to drain the lives of all that live in the Wonderlands, which finally sets about the real stakes of this story, unlike what we've been subjected to the prior 3 chapters. Out of some strange selfishness, Fret is careless of Butt Stallion's passing and insists on our knighting, to which we get a consolation prize of being knighted Squire of the Realm. I'm not sure what the point of this section even is, other than to set in motion a schism between Fret and Valentine that will get axed as quickly as it was introduced, but if it's supposed to be a joke, I'm not laughing. I mean, I haven't been so far of all the feted attempts, save for one, but here I genuinely don't know if this was supposed to be a joke or not. Regardless, in order to reach the pyramid, we need a vessel that is blessed by a bard, in order to ward off its sinking by an underwater entity known as Drill, whose chains are the sea. Keep that name in note, as we will familiarize ourselves again with it, but regardless, our main task is to find a bard, or half-bard, as the NPC notes to us that she last saw said half-bard at the Weepwild Dankness. And while it would be great to explore said dankness and discover who this half-bard is, I think it's about time we heavily deviate from the main story and talk about one of the side quests of this story, or in this case, major side quests. Because unlike the prior games where you were basically given the whole world to play with, here, there's quite a few opportunities to miss some interesting locales if you only go through the story missions, and one such is quite expansive for it being a side quest called Goblins Tired of Forest Oppression, or GTFO for short, which, yes, that in of itself is supposed to be a joke. In order to even get access to this mission, you need to do one of the smaller overworld side quests aplenty throughout, where a bridge craftsman is missing a schematic to locked away in a cave, which is basically code for kill these randomly generated enemies in a procedural dungeon, similarly to when you had to get the shrine pieces for Bach Staub. The mission, in summary, is that a goblin named Jar is tired of the living conditions of his fellow man under a dragon god by the name of Vorkanar, and wants you to help in his endeavors to free them in Mount Kra. This is where, yet again, the social commentary blurs the line between satire of what is perceived as social commentary, as a lot of what Jar is asking for and how to go about doing this does ring parallels to communist uprisings, added with their inaction, I seriously can't tell what gender Jar is supposed to be, in going about enacting said revolution. Shit, there's even a line where he quite literally quotes, seizing the means of production in regards to destroying said means of production. Like, we're supposed to believe in Jar's cause, yet also find it amusing how incapable he is of going about it himself? Or are we also to believe that his means to do so are counterintuitive to the goblin kind, or that the game is poking fun at the concept of a communist revolution? This gets even more muddied as our player character has to destroy one of the barrier conduits in order to proceed, and makes this spicy comment about how its mechanism seems a bit advanced for a goblin to make, and then pulls a "I can't be racist, my friends are black" comment out of nowhere. See what I mean about how making our player character fully voiced like this would betray what we would think about the situations going on, that you make them out to be stereotypical of other races, especially of those we haven't even conceived of with this universe in mind? Like, the only concept of goblins that I have up to this point is the ones that I fought, and I just assume that it's an excuse to facilitate combat more so than any commentary on their disposition towards us, unlike the bandits typically depicted in the Borderlands franchise. So how would my player character exactly, Is it supposed to be that I'm role-playing as some closet racist? Or is this yet again a vain attempt to be funny, completely falling on its face with as much awareness of what you're implying from it as Helen Keller on a good day? And then, just to put the icing on the cake, Jar is hurt by that, but also agrees that it must have been the troll oracles that set these up, meaning that our next task is to kill said oracles to wrench some freedom for the goblins. So, again, I ask, how exactly am I supposed to feel in this moment? Laughter, introspection, annoyance, confusion, or all the fucking above? It's about on par with Marvel Phase 4 writing, where a character says some damning statement about socialism, but we as the audience can't tell if it's supposed to be biting commentary, a joke at the expense of those critical of socialism, or that we should be in stark disagreement of what he just said. You can only shake your head and just move on, and move on we shall. The only through line of this story that does seem aware and consistent is that Jar is a massive coward, and the player character works to fight through said cowardice, mainly through violence. After helping Jar put up some posters and saving them from another oracle, you give them a goblin-sized axe, to which they are obviously apprehensive about using it. After freeing some POWs, you complete the first part of this side quest and advance it to the Slayer of Vorkanar, which, you guessed it, is further helping Jar to upend Vorkanar's entire operation. First is destroying some machines of his, second is disrupting the Great Oven by way of some explosives used by some of the goblins for mining, and killing some frozen entity named Freezicles. And further examples of whether the writers are trying to be self-deprecating about this character or not is that Jar mentions how one of his fellow GTFO members by the name of Gutwrench is all talk but no walk, when this whole entire mission Jar has been more of a sayer than a doer to his grand revolution. But moving on, we kill Freezicles and use its heart to shut down the Great Oven, which gets us right into the main event, facing off Vorkanar himself. The apex of Jar's character arc rears its head when we fight the oracles near Vorkanar's domain, and Jar does help us engage in said fight, only to immediately regret having slain someone by his hand. Which would be a neat moment for our character to build up their confidence, but instead it's made as a contrivance for us to fight Vorkanar alone. And fight alone we do, as Vorkanar is not a dragon, but more like a dragon mech, or something like that, and honestly, it's quite lame we don't really get any clarification as to who he really is, when throughout this side quest he simultaneously speculated upon whether he's a dragon or not. It would have been added to the otherwise incongruous nature of the social commentary in this side quest if it turned out that Vorkanar was a goblin like Jar, and used the act of playing as a god to get to his head and impress the very people he identifies as, but alas, he's just some head on a swivel we wail like a piñata for the loot shower, as per usual. The last part of this mission has you give Jar a reward for their efforts via a cog that they can use as a nose ring, as he does mention nose rings being a point of pride for goblins, but instead gives you back the cog, recognizing that without you, their revolution would be for naught. So I suppose there was some closure to that arc of his, even if it comes with it the burning question as to whether this entire two-part mission was all a gaffe at the idea of faux activism or not. I put this much intention on a mission that would otherwise get ignored and sidelined as a result of how the main story is thrust upon you, is to illustrate how the concept of these missions is one tiresome joke dragged on far longer than it ever had time to be funny in the first place. It's the same deal with the other major side quests that are hidden in locales you have to actively seek out, that whether a joke was made and how best to rotate a mission around it than the other way around. Because it's not like I'm getting much introspection as to how goblins live, other than that they hate scenic views, see nose rings like a crown, and may have connections with the damned, as imps also shared space with them and have a similar aesthetic to them. And even if we did, it would only impart the goblins in Mount Krog, not the other goblins that you fight mindlessly like most of the other hostile mobs present throughout the overworld. Now you would say that it reeks of Tiny Tina's lack of creativity when it comes to her world building, which in turn would cause another layer of meta commentary on her flaws as a character, but this is another example similarly to implying that when Athena is monologuing the story of the pre-sequel, that she is a unreliable narrator whenever any contrivance or plot hole in said retelling is present. We can't assume that the writers deliberated this lack of lore building to chastise Tiny Tina more so than their utter lack of giving the world any meaning to it, as I feel a lot of Wonderland's world is a vehicle driving the stereotypical D&D experience rather than it being a fully realized world in of itself. And it will get more convoluted when we discuss the main story further. And in our attempts to get the story going is a joke that is so bad that it actively hampers our attempting to get to the story. So there's a cheese curl in the overworld that Fret acknowledges that is in our way, and instead of moving it out of the way, Tiny Tina gets the brilliant idea that it's a part of the game world, and that in order to move it we have to clear out a dungeon in order to do so. Never has there been a joke in a Borderlands game that has come at the complete expense of the game's narrative, save for that one in particular, but there it was at least mercifully short, unlike here where it just makes Tiny Tina so stubborn to deny her mistake, and frustrating that we have to fight another procedural just to literally get the plot moving again. And for what exactly? What is this doing for the character other than maybe to home in on Tina's immaturity, as it's not something often considered in the Borderlands franchise, but again, with how every other mission being made thus far, I fully believe the writers only thought of this mission as a way to be humorous beyond all else. Well, after that 5 minutes of wasted time, we arrive at the dankness and get back to that schism between Fret and Valentine that I mentioned earlier. Abruptly, of course, as there wasn't any dialogue shared between them leading up to this, other than that they bumped heads regarding going to Bud Stallion so early. Supposedly, Fret is all about the rules and the loot regarding the game, whereas Valentine is all about the heroics and adventure that comes with it. And even Dragonlord takes notice of this and uses it again to drive a wedge between them and Tina, who at this point is barely keeping this together. As for the player character's thoughts on this, well, remember folks, when you make a character that someone behind the curtain can customize yet also have to script lines for them, the only compromise you can make is to make them mute for your benefit. Although I guess you can also say that the player character is mainly trying to be proactive in finding this bard in order to stop the Dragonlord and not getting caught up by the past, so maybe I'm giving the writers more credit here than due. At least until we come up to who said bard is, which is none other than Mr. Torg. And no, he's not some fantasy variant of Mr. Torg like the other characters present. He's just Torg. The only difference is that he carries a lute around and his swears or bleeds by a lute riff rather than a guitar riff. Oh, and I guess Mr. Torg just randomly blurting out some vague socio-political slant in the middle of regarding things he likes is now a character aspect of him, because I'm sure when the writers of the pre-sequel made him their personal pulpit to wax about how friend-zoning is imaginary and misogynistic, they were totally doing it in jest, guys. But hey, I guess I can't be too mad when the writing forces humor so much that it retcons other writing prior to being made a joke rather than some serious statement, so we take our licks when we can get them. In order to get Mr. Tor to accompany you to get to your ship Seabound, you need to fix his loot, which means to be not working on account of him just smashing it like an axe and the various crystal pylons scattered about. Dragonlord quickly exclaims that he's using these pylons to harvest soul energy from this place in order to propel his own power through the Sword of Souls before sending more of his skelly goons at you through them. Why Dragonlord needs to do this will get a bit further elaborated, but again, it would have done service to the world building for Tina to suggest that the Sword of Souls doesn't work on Dragonlord because of his need to do this in order to perpetuate himself. Regardless, the rest of this sequence is following Tor to other crystal pylons, destroying the mobs that generate from there, and rinse and repeat. The only thing of note is that Dragonlord starts to do his own narrating, of course in a sardonic tone, wishing for your doom, which again does draw some interesting parallels. We enter the heart of the forest to find the main source of all this dark energy, which engages you in a fight with the Banshee. According to Dragonlord, that's a surprising boss for Tina to pull on us heroes this early into the campaign, although I'm not sure if he is being slightly condescending when he says that, considering that, at worst, the Banshee has these stupid line beams that you have to limbo around, while the rest of the stage is basically a kill zone if you don't. As for Torg, he doesn't help you engage in this fight, although I suppose with him being a bard, well, also being a barbarian, you can't really do much to help here, despite that there wasn't even any dialogue for him to contrive a reason not to. Anyway, you defeat the Banshee, to which Dragonlord is quite impressed by. Hey, at least he isn't always talking you down. But alas, the tree has already been long corrupted and it's too late for Torg to get his magic back. However, you hear a cry from said crystal hanging in the balance, and like the rest, you shoot it, which in turn frees the Fairy Punch Father who is basically Borderlands 3 Brick with some fairy wings and a skirt. Which is a bit auspicious that he looked like his Borderlands 3 counterpart more than his Borderlands 2 counterpart, since Tina doesn't look a day older than she was in Borderlands 2 to here, but I digress. This was all likely a compromise with reusing the assets you already got, instead of making new ones. The Punch Father restores the balance in the dankness, which in turn fixes Torg's loot, and he conjures a teleporter back to the Brighthoof docks from that. As for the Punch Father, he doesn't really get any further elaboration to try to connect his relationship with Tina, and he more or less gets sidelined to one of the other major side quests I've mentioned before. You can suppose this was done as to not find themselves into a scenario where they dare try to weave any continuity between the other games, since that worked so well when the pre-sequel attempted that, but regardless, the chapter ends abruptly here, and now we'll see what going Seabound for us holds. After going back to the docks, you proceed to have Torg bless your ship, at least before Fret and Valentine start bickering again. Through this, Torg starts to notice that your team has been divided and thus needs to get the good vibes back, which is a procession of you playing musical instruments with Torg, as Tiny Tina tries to explain to both Fret and Valentine why each of their viewpoints are correct and that they should be respected as such. Through this, we get even the smallest inkling of introspection on these new characters presented to us, that Fret likes the campaign because of how she can make sense of it living in a world that doesn't, and Valentine likes the campaign because he feels more like a hero than he does having crashed their spaceship to end up in the very predicament they're in. Unfortunately, that's about the most we ever get about who these people are, or even what they mean to each other, because I suppose the writers feel compelled to have them show up abruptly in the next mainline title. Yeah, good luck with that given how BL3 treated its legacy characters, much less new ones, to branch their character out, or that Gearbox got big money to hire these A-list actors and wanted to flex that through making a character around the meta of said actor. Which is perhaps one thing I didn't really mention regarding the choice of talent to provide the Borderlands 3, that it had Ice-T, ProZD, or Penn Jillette as voice actors whom the characters are made around your knowing of said person. It causes this dissonance for the game experience when a character has to be one note because it would betray whatever we thought of the actor playing said character, when they shouldn't be designed like this. Like, imagine if in Black Ops 1 if Joseph Bowman, who Ice Cube voiced, just was a 1960s version of himself rather than a character who happens to share the voice of Ice Cube, which is also why that Fret and Valentine aren't and can't be fleshed out as characters because of the fact that Andy Samberg and Wanda Sykes are voicing them, and both are more well known for their comedy roles than anything else. Interesting considering that while Dragonlord does have his moments of forced humor, it is taken much more seriously as a character despite who voices him. Nevertheless, the group settle their differences and the vibes are restored. So restored, in fact, it gets Torg into exhilarated fury to nuke the ocean, which is a neat callback to a line of dialogue he had in the Assault on Dragonkeep DLC. The entire set piece involving the nuking of the ocean is amusing. Note that I said amusing and not humorous, as while I wasn't laughing, I did find the concept pretty amusing to watch. To see the flurry of missile silos just suddenly arise from the ocean sea, the explosion from the barrage, the tidal wave that crashes into your character in Brighthoof. But there is one nagging question about all this. What implications does it have for our character's morality regarding it? And that was the entire chapter of this story. Yes, you heard that right. The moment you go through the teleporter to the docks and play with the musical instruments to the nuking of the ocean is the entire chapter. You might think with me analyzing the story at length that I'd be grateful how short this one is, considering how long this video already is at this point, but I think it shows more how cut for time the game's main story feels, with it having as many chapters as the pre-sequel, yet feeling only half the length given that we're nearly halfway through the game's narrative at this point. And with the way this game's DLC was fashioned and its replayability being severely limited, this game feels like a DLC for Borderlands 3 rather than a fully realized title of the DLC that it is iterating upon when it shouldn't be. But still, how do we proceed to the pyramid now with the ocean gone, and how does this choice fall upon our heroes? So with the ocean nuked, it means that our heroes now have to get to the pyramid on foot and on the surface of the seabed. Now, Dragonlord, who has been playing up the villain trope thus far, seeing you commit this act, would have you assume he'd be quite thrilled you would go to such lengths just to get to him. But no, in fact, he's actually quite upset that Tina would be so desperate as to do something like this just to get her story back on track. Which, inquisitive minds might retort and say, wait, Torg did that, not Tiny Tina. But remember, everything that has, can, and will happen in this campaign is all at Tiny Tina's behest. So, through Torg, she was the one that thought nuking the ocean was necessary to get her narrative back on track. And through our abetting of this circumstance, Dragonlord uses it as a way to guilt-trip us and our supposed heroics, as even our own player character weakly tries to vindicate our actions in this. You know when I said it would have been nice if once, just once, in Borderlands 3 that Tyrene had any semblance of sympathy for the COV that willingly make themselves fodder for her, that she would try to distort the player character's morality as being just as villainous as she supposedly is? This is exactly the kind of dialogue that I like hearing from the main antagonists of the game, that they aren't just utterly reprehensible and have at least some humanity left in them to know when the supposed heroes do something quite villainous and hand wave it off because they believe they are in the right for doing so. Let's also not forget that Dragonlord has already implied multiple times thus far that he has been forced into this position, almost shoehorned into the villain trope for reasons I can't quite spell just yet, but it is nevertheless important to note that Dragonlord is not even necessarily a villain simply because he's the main antagonist. I mean, the pre-sequel showed us quite plainly that the real villains are the ones who pretended to help us in our endeavors. Nevertheless, we press on. The way to the Borderlands Shallows is once again impeded by another overworld quest where, you guessed it, have to do another dungeon encounter and collect a MacGuffin in order to clear out the seaweed. So the first time this happened I assumed it was done as a stupid joke, but now with it being done twice, this isn't just a fluke, it's a coincidence. Which makes me wonder if impeding the main story this way was meant to, in a manner of speaking, groom the player base into the endgame content loop of Wonderlands and expect it to be no more complex than it. It's certainly an extremely clunky way of doing that, assuming that this isn't also a way of dragging out the perceived length of game completion of the main story, seeing as the prior games didn't need to roadblock entry to the main plot with other side quests in tow. After gaining permission to continue the main story, we enter into the Shallows where Dragonlord continues to browbeat the Fatemaker, and in turn, the spectators and BM for allowing this to happen. As I mentioned earlier about how Dragonlord feels like a mistreated toy, he mentioned Tina's campaign as a
Wasteland of broken toys, wondering why their creator has forsaken them.
which just really hits the nail on the thematic through line of Dragonlord's own mistreatment at her hands. But enough of that, we do have to wrestle with the choice we've made, even if it ultimately felt unnecessary other than for the callback and the set piece to be laid in place. Traveling a fair distance, we are introduced to one of the few new characters exclusive to the Wonderlands campaign and not a derivative of anything else. Bones Threewood, but for my sake I'll just refer to him as Threewood, as his first name is sort of a pseudonym as we go on. He is currently guarding the Southern Gate. They have different names for the compass directions, bear with me, on account of him being exiled from his crew, and while he lets you in with no issue, he warns that in order to get through the Nerpen Gate, and by extension closer to the Pyramid, you have to face off against Chartreuse LeChance. Threewood figures that in order to convince LeChance to let you through, you need to help him build back up his crew, which is causing certain parallels of a certain anime to spring to mind. Regardless, the sequence involves you first assembling his bird Munculus, which will allow him to locate the rest of his crew, and secondly, to persuade them, or in your case, force them back into his ranks. The main distinction about Threewood, one aired by Dragonlord and the crew he used to have, is that Threewood is unloyal and backstabbery, bringing parallels to Clay from Borderlands 3 regarding his duplicity on the matter. The second, which would require you to catch the subtext of Threewood and by extension LeChance's dialogue, is that he's gay, and gay for LeChance, which is honestly quite a breath of fresh air to see a gay character depicted this subtly, considering how abrupt and over the head the last time Gearbox wanted to remind you that, in fact, this character is gay. It reminds me of how Hammerlock was presented as gay but not made out to be the only defining characteristic of him. that if representation of these sexualities is so important, that normalization of them should be that it's not the only defining characteristic gets lost on so-called modern media that has about as much grace about it as flinging shit and calling your hands clean. After assembling the bird, Threewood mentions that LeChance is unkillable by a curse known as plot armor. Yes, it's getting that meta with the jokes regarding the plot. But there is some significance as to how that curse was given to him, and this curse also applies to Threewood and his first mate, who's the first out of the lot of skeleton pirates to recruit. In order to do so, you need to break their mug, which ensues in a diss-off where you get to choose the diss. However, each one, regardless which you choose, is just a slight variation of a inverse Yo Mama joke that falls really flat, yet regardless goads the pirates into fighting you, which of course you defeat them. Defeat them, not kill them, as Threewood clarifies that while they can't be killed, they certainly can still feel pain, so it's a nice version of how said plot armor curse works in this universe. Throughout this whole forming a pirate crew, Valentine is absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect, mainly because he likes the lifestyle of a pirate being similar to the lifestyle he and Fret embark upon, which again is the only smidgen of introspection as to who these characters outside of the D&D experience are, of which to be barely mentioned again. Regardless, we arrive at Plunder Port to recruit the next batch of pirates, that being the Swabby and Cabin Boy. Like before, you have to goad them into a fight by way of blowing up some balloons and a really big balloon, because, you know, Hindenburg and all, which causes another floating house of pirates to flood in. Conspicuously, all the pirates here are not skeletons and not also plagued by this curse, so are they just residents of Plunder Port and not a part of LeChance's crew? Like, it'd be like if Blackbeard's deckhand just ordered the residents of Tortuga just to fight on his behalf, which, speaking of Pirates of the Caribbean, the subplot of Ballad of Bones also has parallels to the first movie. Regardless, you defeat them and they reluctantly team up with Threewood. The third part of this pirate endeavor is reforming Threewood's ship, the Marley Maiden, of which LeChance currently has under his control. On the way, Threewood tries to tell some of his backstory, to which Valentine gets an out-of-body experience as to the nature of this curse, to which Tiny Tina gives a lackadaisical response, prompting Dragonlord again to criticize how poorly she's controlling this narrative. Is it me, or is Dragonlord starting to become a inner negative conscience of Tina rather than a beaten puppet for her ends? You know, just a thought considering his true intentions. You arrive at the Marley Maiden, to which we get an interaction between LeChance and Threewood, with the former referring to the latter as bloods rather than bones, which again will be important for later. Before we can chime on that subtle line, we have to board the ship, at least what's left of it, with a procession of skeleton pirates and skeleton mini-bosses who conveniently aren't cursed with plot armor for this section. Regardless, it is a nice little set piece to have, boarding the ship like you would a pirate and slowly reassembling the parts of the ship in order to conjure it back to life via some haunted organ. After all that excitement, the Fatemaker asks Threewood what was the deal with LeChance calling him Bloods instead of Bones, to which he essentially lays out his dirty laundry through some set pieces you walk into but are designed almost like the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction, with quite a jingle of a sea shanty to boot. In short, Threewood made a deal with Dragonlord to make he and the rest of his crew, including LeChance, immortal so that they could be together forever, but didn't chance that Dragonlord would monkey's paw that deal so that they'd lose their mortal form. Something, again, that feels ripped note for note the Aztec curse from said Pirates movie, other than the context for how they got the curse in the first place. So yeah, the plot armor actually was foundational to understanding Threewood's character arc, and not just put in to poke at the meta humor of it existing as a concept, even if its existence for certain enemies seems loosely defined. So Threewood had you do all of that in order to right the wrongs of his decision and find some solace in making it up to LeChance, the person he couldn't bear to lose the most. Of course, that does come with the question of whether this happened far before the nuking of the ocean, as he was guarding a gate that supposedly would have been submerged in water, along with the remains of his crew, the bird, and his ship all lying underneath the pressure of it prior to it. Otherwise, I imagine all of those would have been washed away with the same veracity as the water did, if it didn't completely vaporize from the radiation entirely. Although I suppose I am asking a bit too much of the world building here, and of the complexity of his character, as Threewood isn't a particularly deep one. But at the same time, does he really need to be? He's at least got a straightforward arc that isn't too hard to follow and ties up any qualms regarding it towards the end, unlike some other characters that feel as though they've barely begun to have an arc, much less end it. Normally, the note-taker's notes are cut between chapter breaks, but this one we get one interspersed just before the boss encounter, that being facing off against LeChance and his skeleton crew, bar the pun. It's mainly a monologue about how loss will occur during the hero's journey, but they must press on to set things right. This could be an analogy for what Threewood is doing, or even what we are doing, even though if it's in regard to the loss of the ocean, that was a loss we incurred upon ourselves rather than something we could have known would happen, so not sure if it really hits that same thematic mark. We make it to the boss arena and LeChance's ship, the Tempest Scorn. LeChance and Threewood share some more dialogue before you engage against LeChance and beat him like you did the rest of the crew with said curse. Afterwards, the Fatemaker gets LeChance and Threewood to hash out the differences. Threewood apologizes and ensures that he'll make it up to him for as long as he remains undead. And the final touch on this arc is Threewood mentioning again the notable phrase about how fate brings us together and how he'll likely see you again, which you can and also help Threewood and LeChance break the curse they have in another of the major side quests later down the game. As far as chapter sections go and huge subplots are concerned, this is a nice through line of the pirate aesthetic combined with a touching story of what someone will do for the ones they love. Even if said story does have to retread a lot of the stereotypes about pirate life and often the romanticized parts of it, it's nice to see the subtext of someone being gay used well and even at all to weave that narrative home. And while this chapter is laden with the usual flat jokes and horrible puns, like when Threewood says he needs a LeChance because he needs a second chance, this is definitely one of the more enjoyable and memorable chapters of this story. And with the consequences of our actions regarding the nuking of the ocean taken notice with Dragonlord's Ernest, and not used as purely a amusing set piece, means that this story is trying better to weave ambiguity in our hero's morality rather than it being non-existent in Borderlands 3 and used as a cheap selling point in the pre-sequel. But regardless, we've crossed the Nerping Gate, meaning there is yet more seabed for us to toil. After exiting through the Nerping Gate, Tiny Tina conjures up a shortcut away from entering the Wartooth Shallows, which in any other game would completely defeat the point of us having done the horror ordeal of Ballad of Bones. It's not like this would have been the first time either. Gameplay wise makes sense, as it would be mighty inconvenient for us to have to proceed through the entire level just to get back into the darker depths of the seabed floor. Like with the prior two chapters, this quest is also blockaded by another overworld quest in which you need to uncover an eyeglass, of which will reveal a hidden bridge for us to proceed into the Drowned Abyss. Although, unlike the unfunny Cheese Puff blockade and the filler Seaweed blockade, getting this eyeglass actually serves a gameplay purpose, as scattered throughout the overworld are other noticeable bridge gaps that you can gain access to now having acquired said glass piece. Which, if the prior two overworld quests also had cheese meteors and seaweed blocking certain collectibles or lore, would enhance the want of exploring said overworld, but alas, they only exist in a vacuum for humor once again. Once entering the Drowned Abyss, Tiny Tina remarks the atmosphere of the place and her elation of you coming across her favorite character, to which Dragonlord bites back on her phrasing of such things. What the service is the next character arc of the story, wherein instead of Fred and Valentine having a schism with themselves, have a schism with how Tiny Tina forces this character upon them. How so? Well, to start, we're introduced to Kisara in a way that makes her off-putting to Valentine, by way of referring to us as
smooth skin,
and of her ominous tone of voice regarding the history of said location. Of course, Tiny Tina tries to reassure the party while backhandedly acknowledging how much she's laying on thick her demeanor towards us. Whether that is her intention or not will have to be saved once this particular conflict is resolved, but for my sake, it is a bit odd how Fred and Valentine were willing to take Tina at her word of Bones Threewood being friendly, despite being an enemy we've come to blows with, but not with Kisara, Coil, who we haven't even come across their type yet, much less know their disposition towards. Which, of course, is hostile, but that's besides the point. This particular interaction feels a bit forced when it didn't need to be. As we proceed to read the inscriptions on the shrines as instructed by Kisara, she gives us a lore dump about what the drowning entails, which is basically the Atlantis parable, just changing the terms around, assuming that story wasn't public domain. Drill, I told you that name would become relevant later, had become consumed by power, and with his arrogance came the other gods smiting him and the coiled city down into the depths. What those other gods were, or how this lines up with the existence of Dragonlord or Butt Stallion, is anyone's guess. After we read the last inscription, can we enter into the Temple of Sacrifice, something Valentine points out as potentially us being the sacrifice. Even Dragonlord imparts that Tiny Tina is laying the twist on too thick, despite her insistence that Kisara is really cool. Forgive me if I don't believe that, if the developers couldn't have even bothered giving her a unique character card whenever she talks. But through this also causes a rift in Tina's ability to keep the campaign narratively consistent, as she proclaims you need to light a fire in what was an underwater temple, retrieve a fish that would have been wiped out from the nuking of the ocean, and so on. See, unlike in the GTFO side quest where it's clear that it was the writers' failings to give more cohesive world building, here the writers are making pointed criticisms at Tina's own world building, even if this will be the only time this gets lampshaded this hard, other than Dragonlord's quips. And the only time that our advisors whom spectate this have any awareness and criticisms towards how Tina is moving this narrative forward, considering that they are adults enjoying a spectacle driven by a child. Once you get the firefish, you put it upon the altar, as Fret expects you to be part of the ritual. It turns out it's not, and while Fret is relieved about that, Valentine is still wary, using any analogy that doesn't involve the word skin to express such, given that what Tiny Tina promised earlier. We'll get to that narrative Chekhov's gun here soon. Dragonlord once again chides Tina's obvious lampshading of what Kisara is narratively, and how we're more or less placating the experience. While I do understand why Dragonlord is saying this, I do feel simultaneously the writers are showing their hand a bit too hard as to not confuse their audience as to what the twist will be. Near the end of the passage, Kisara awaits us conveniently despite not having taken the passage we did, which again raises our respective party suspicions. So of course the wool is pulled from our eyes and it's revealed that Kisara wanted to join with us all along, having survivor's guilt regarding the fall of her civilization by the temptations of Drill along with her sisters. Dragonlord isn't quite satisfied that the twist wasn't even a twist at all and conjures said sisters to intervene. Interestingly, Kisara even has dialogue to account for such an encounter, which once again gets the noggin jogging about how not all of this is necessarily beyond Tiny Tina's own whims to arbitrate. After fighting off more Coiled, Kisara thanks for our friendship and wants a hug from us as she...
It has been so long since I felt the warmth of another on my skin.
Of course, because Tina did state she would simultaneously combust whoever said that word next time has to go through with it, using said fire mode that was guiding us to do just the trick. Completely exasperated, Tiny Tina takes her frustrations out on us by having us fight Drill, whose chains are the sea, as well as his other counterparts, as this is a quite drawn out 3-phase fight, which I can only assume it's set that way to allow the back and forth between Tiny Tina and the respective party to play out uninterrupted. In short, Tiny Tina had planned out a whole story for Kisara and had to throw it out both because she assumed that the party would be amicable towards her and that they would skirt the rules they've made in said campaign to allot it. She also expresses frustration that they would have such little confidence in Kisara's intentions, despite the fact that her dialogue and locations would imply a more insidious nature to her. All this completely plays into Dragonlord's own feelings towards her, as it's his way to express to you exactly who she is deep down, and not what she presents herself as. It's perhaps the only time, too, that the game even seems to recognize Tina's age, that she's not an adult but still an adolescent, who hadn't really any parents to raise her properly, even if those circumstances were out of her control. Regardless, while I do like this attempt at criticizing her character, I do find that it arrives at this point in a pretty clunky manner, both in how Fret and Valentine, out the get, are apprehensive towards Kisara, and how Tina aggressively demands your adoration of said character, just to ensure to the audience they aren't confused as to what's happening. After defeating Drill thrice, does Tina stop with the tantrums and exposes her insecurities, mainly that she was afraid that if Fret and Valentine didn't like Kisara, that they wouldn't like her in turn. Once again, we also get a line about how she's afraid to be left alone again regarding their current situation outside of the D&D experience, but why she's alone in the first place after the events? of the Fight for Sanctuary DLC, well, that's just another problem we kick down the road. Regardless, the two reassure her that they're having fun even in spite of having a boss thrust upon themselves. After chapter end, but not before the next chapter sequence, Dragonlord still isn't satisfied with the resolution and uses this as another opportunity to browbeat how Tiny Tina treats this world with malice that she projects her faults upon, which honestly, how I put it, is not even nearly as tactful as he did. Which makes Dragonlord all the more interesting, what with his intentions prior about ridding her grasp on said world, that while the D&D experience is atypically set upon good versus evil, could come with much more nuance when we dig in. But still, this chapter is the most and only scathing remark towards Tiny Tina, as the ones after this either only pad out time or go more into who Dragonlord is, which we will find out soon. Just before you leave the Godswell, there is another note-taker log you can listen to where he monologues about how the Fatemaker begins to doubt their path in lieu of how damaged the world has become. While this may spark allusions to us nuking the ocean prior, this doesn't really get lampshaded any more than the chapter after it and here, so this line feels matter-of-fact. As with completing the Ballad of Bones chapter, Tiny Tina gives you a shortcut past the Drowned Abyss section as you head your way towards Kronak's Wall. Like I said, I had no issues with this regarding having to backtrack through the level area, but at the same time, this does show some amount of discontent for the main slice of these games, especially once the endgame nature of Wonderlands rears its head. Once entering Kronak's Wall, Dragonlord shows his displeasure that you are still playing by her game, as though expecting you to understand where he's coming from and how it feels to have your fate chosen for you, deciding to own up to the villain facade she's given him. Again, really interesting subtext behind those lines, but unfortunately, this chapter doesn't elaborate on his character until the next one. Tina presents a magic relic to you, to which out of your curiosity and Valentine's touch it. In spawns the Wastard, who's the last companion we'll come across that will guide us through this chapter's arc, like Bones 3 would and Kasara did. He says that he used to have a mortal form, but because of his insubordination to Dragonlord, got his soul ripped out of it and put into one of these relics. He says that he can help you get to him and to strike a weakness in him if you help retrieve his body by way of teaching us a hex that he and other Wastards know. As I said a few chapters ago, Wastard is supposed to be a Wonderlands variant of Clay, although with that I might have been more generous with that distinction than the game does, because first off, Fret opens with saying that she doesn't have any qualms about trusting this necromancer as a way to mature from her suspicions regarding Kasara last chapter, and secondly that the Wastard himself doesn't sport the kind of subtle duplicity that Clay did or even Bones 3 would did in its own game, especially when Wastard already told us why he's in this current predicament. It's also odd that Wastard does have his own character card but no character intro unlike 3 would or Torg did, which gets me to assume laziness off the developers now that we are approaching what would be considered the third act in this story, as last chapter was a awkward second act low point. Towards the cliff face, you eye the Skelevator, as Wastard puts it, and he tries to bring it down, only for it to tumble and crash. From it crashing, it's also being protected by a barrier hex, which is going to be a running theme for most of this area, and what's to come near the end of this chapter. Trying to bring the jaw of the elevator to heal proves unfruitful, as the quartz below it is sapping the soul energy that would power it, so Wastard has you go find a relic, like the one he was put in, to overpower the energy around it. As with the hexes, the quartz are also plentiful throughout and give some modicum of world building as to what Dragonlord intends and how he goes about his insidious plan. Something that could have been done when we were destroying the damn things during the Thy Bard with a Vengeance chapter instead of Torg being, well, Torg. Because up to this point, I just called them crystals, since they look like the crystals you'd get from completing a level in Crash Bandicoot, as Torg never once mentioned specifically what the things we're destroying even are. You make it to the Relic Repository, not to be confused with the Relic Repository you were at a few chapters ago, to find a suitable candidate, to which you get more of a procession of forced humor, because Borderlands not being synonymous with forced humor is a day that doesn't end in Y. You end up finding one hidden among the rest, as the ones you looked at were incompatible, and head up to a platform above where you can use yourself as a conduit to power the relic's energy. Again, this would have been an opportunity to spoon-feed some duplicity in Blastard if that was even the intention behind his writing, as he's made it a habit of possessing you as a way to get around the map, and seems to share some sentiments regarding how necromancers feel about heroes after finding out Coil are also prevalent around after you kill Drill, whose boss fight is a tease. You and the gang all chant a phrase to channel the relic, which the phrase is totally not another reference to Evil Dead, I'm sure, which reassembles the elevator for you to ascend back up to surface level. You make it to where Bastard's body was currently being channeled, which ensues a boss arena as Dragonlord obviously lampshades as he assumes control of it. And while this video is supposed to be tackling the story more than the gameplay, the Bastard boss fight has got to be the hardest and most annoying in Wonderlands, as he has this ranged attack that can one-tap you, an invisible Drake that can recharge his shield, and can summon explosions from the sky that can also one-tap you. The only thing that is forgiving about him is that once you get to his third health bar, he becomes several skeleton copies that charge mindlessly at you, although this does replicate a mechanic with the Katagawa boss fight that was equally as time-consuming. After defeating Bastard's body, the Bastard recovers it and fulfills his end of the deal by helping you rid of Dragonlord's hex barriers, which amounts in gameplay terms to other barriers blocked off in the overworld that allow you to get more dice and or lore throughout. In exchange, you need to portion off a part of your soul to do so, but in story terms is basically meaningless and it's just played up like a joke, once again squandering any potential risk aligned with it or implications for the story going forward, or any potential regarding Bastard's characterization, as he just seems no more nuanced than a generic NPC in a side quest, despite how much screen time he gets here. And so ends Chapter 8, which by this point has once again drained my engagement in the story that was reinvigorated in Chapter 3. But Chapter 9 going onward, we're finally going to get some answers as to who Dragonlord really is. As with the prior two chapters, completing this one nets you a shortcut past Kronak's wall. Right after, Tina displays some apprehension to the idea that you could get done with this campaign, as Fret mentions that they should get back to fixing their ship. Again, with as little nuance to go for it, Tina mentions that the outside world sucks right now, which I'm not sure if that's meta commentary on what the fuck was going on back in late 2021 to early 2022 when this game came out, or within the game's own continuity, but alas, we'll never know. Although her wanting to pad out the campaign so that you and the gang can continue to play it will be brought up again throughout this chapter and the next, so this is more done to illustrate her loneliness and need for attachments, using the D&D campaign as a vehicle to drive that sentiment home. However, the aching question becomes why Tiny Tina is supposedly isolated from the Crimson Raiders and from Brick or Mordecai to be this lonely, which is why lines like, "The world super sucks right now," doesn't elucidate her circumstances at the moment. So we arrive at the Osogul Necropolis, a resting ground of dead souls for which is the base for Dragonlord's pyramid. In entering, Dragonlord gives this whole spiel about how he'll wrestle control of the Wonderlands away from Tiny Tina by using the soul energy he is absorbing to essentially Thanos snap this world from her control. This would all be fine and dandy as typical supervillain ultimatums go, but once we understand what Dragonlord really is, this line causes a lot of problems for the conception of this world and our conception of him once it's addressed. Another note-taker line is introduced to us right near the beginning of Osogul, a bit contemporary from the other note-taker scrolls we've taken thus far, as it almost teases our power creep, especially considering what gun I'm holding in this clip, as we near the moment of truth of this campaign. Bastard's gift to us does prove fruitful here, as there are a variety of barrier hexes we need to activate to get us onward. There are also soul wells which require us both to dispel and to rid of the protectors of said well to emerge onward, which we do several times throughout our excursion into Osogul. I did love to mention there is one more friendly character you come across on your way here by the name of simply the Elder, who got himself trapped here by the barrier hex when he heard tell of Blood Stallion being killed. His only real purpose being here is to tease the possibility of Blood Stallion coming back from the dead, as that was the Elder's purpose being here, which I mean, wouldn't be the first time a Borderlands game undermined a character dying, but to add insult to injury is that Valentine thinks we can do so simply because fate brings us together. As I already alluded to prior, that line is mocked, but also uses the very cornerstone for one of the major themes present in this game, So it's weird how often this game literally steps on its own toes to get their minute-by-minute humor quota. Anyhow, in order to get into the Hall of Heroes, a bit of a curious name for a place that is supposedly evil, we need to clear the wells of sins like we did with the one that barred us access into Osagul. After clearing the wells, even Fret and Valentine are oozing with anticipation at fighting the boss, but Tina relents, trying any which way she can to pad the campaign without it being apparent that's what she's doing. Once you dive into the catacombs, Dragonlord gives some lore dumps about the nature of Osagul and its prior owners, the Vatu, who knew how to siphon soul energy so greatly that they got absorbed with it, alluding to what Dragonlord might also intend with Tina given the opportunity. But again, the how will be much more important than the why once we know more of who Dragonlord is. Proceeding through, Dragonlord starts to get a bit meta about the nature of this campaign, questioning your very conception of knowing that you are one of many other fate makers who did the same thing you're doing right now. Maybe a bit too meta, however, as he criticizes the very fact that you don't even have a name beyond Fate Maker to Tina, when that issue is more of a game design issue and not a criticism of Tina's character of dehumanizing the protagonist. Like, it's not within the game's own ability to be able to recite a character whose name could be a random garble of symbols or some ethnic slur or what have you, so this seems to be a case of Dragonlord buying too much the hands that feeds this storyline. Once arising from the catacombs, there is one more barrier hex being blocked, at which you need to repurpose some arcane device to blow a hole wide enough to get into the Hall of Heroes, which this set piece has all too familiar a setup regarding blowing up some Meridian vats to get to Troy and Tyrene in Borderlands 3. Anyhow, once you've blown it up, Tiny Tina starts to blubber about how much she loves playing with us as a sort of way to soften the blow about what is to happen next. As you drop down into the
Obvious boss arena.
You are introduced to the Nightmare, a skeleton knight body using the decapitated head of Bud Stallion as a top, and the set piece is pretty neat, all things considered, but unfortunately what this means that when Tiny Tina said that Bud Stallion dying wasn't supposed to happen, she was fucking lying, or at least it wasn't supposed to happen the way that it did, by way of Dragonlord coming in out of nowhere like Randy Orton, which also means what Dragonlord says after doing so that he controls this story now. He was also flapping his gums, as Tina did intend to have Bud Stallion killed, just not in that manner. But what other manner would it be beyond a beheading, or moreover, everything else set up prior with us having retrieved the Sword of Souls, getting knighted, and the assault? What is in Tiny Tina's control to dictate the narrative? But those questions may very well be laid to rest or cause greater confusion once we proceed onward. Once you defeat the Nightmare, of course Fret and Valentine are appalled at the situation, which gives Tina the opportunity to blame the Dragonlord for doing this, which he retorts by saying that, of course she does, it can never be her fault, which is a perplexing line given that he was the one that beheaded Bud Stallion to facilitate this boss fight this way, but moreover that he wanted to lean in on the villain trope his way, so wouldn't he take that with a bit of pride? But regardless, this gives him an opportunity to show you what he means by her lack of accountability, which ensues a cutscene. And while normally I would do my best to recite the cutscene as it plays out and then tackle the nuances within, but with this scene in particular, it is mostly dialogue, and I feel it best to let the cutscene speak for itself.
Those scrolls weren't prophecies. I wanted to show you what she did to me. What she's doing to you all over again.
Okay, Tina. This is your first time playing, right?
I mean, yeah? Who would I play with? Everyone else I know is dead. What's it called?
Bunkers and Badasses. It's a fantasy game. A place where you can be a hero. Where your imagination can change the world.
Ooh, I'm the best at imagining, baby. I got a whole Wonderland over here.
That's perfect. But first, we gotta make a character. Tell me about your Fate Maker.
As so many do. With a heart full of fire and dreams full of dragons. Magic.
He's the coolest, most powerful hero that everyone wants to be friends with. The Dragon Knight.
Dragon Knight. Yeah, I like it.
Thank you. Hey, this is probably dumb to say, and it's just really cool
Well, let's go make some more. Tina, I want to make this an adventure you'll never forget.
It feels like something lost long ago has been found again. It feels like home.
You reach the inner chamber of the Obsidian Peak Cathedral. The Sword of Souls sits before you. Now, this is a big choice. So,
He takes it and he blows up every bad guy everywhere.
are you sure?
Oh yeah, I do it. Boom!
Alright, but that turns your character evil.
What? No, girl, Dragon Knight ain't evil. He's a hero. He's a Fatebreaker.
He just blew up thousands of people. Don't you think that's evil?
It's not evil. This is stupid. I'm not playing this anymore. You know what? I'm gonna be the bunker master, and then I'll make sure only heroes win.
Tina, wait.
The Fatemaker is alone. Abandoned for a crime he never chose. He's never chosen anything. He begins to think for himself. No more dice or fate. No more masters. I dream of dragons and magic. I awaken, my heart filled with fire and purpose. Resurrection. I am reborn, the Dragon Lord. Do you still believe there's a choice, Fatemaker?
There is always a way to deny evil.
I hoped you could see the truth. I'm not evil. She just writes me this way.
So with that, we finally figure out who the Dragon Lord is, and with that revelation causes many great payoffs from before, but also many problems from before and going forward. Dragon Lord was, mechanically, a fate maker that Tiny Tina created when introduced to bunkers and badasses, but became a negative inner conscious of hers once he was discarded because of an evil decision he didn't make. While very interesting on the surface and adds a lot of intrigue and sympathy for the villain, this causes major issues in that this conception of Dragonlord is only within our own imagination of him, as Tina has conveyed to us. So of course the question becomes, is this version of Dragonlord only our twisted schizophrenic version of him, or is he really as physically real as he is figuratively within this D&D campaign? Especially when Dragonlord said way earlier that only we can hear him, and that Fret and Valentine are utterly unaware of our exchanges with him, as well as even Tina. But again causes issues when things that are done outside of Tina's control that the party is aware of, aka the beheading of Butt Stallion, would require the party to share our own conception of him. So if our conversations with Dragonlord are made up, are we also making up that entire scenario and that the beheading of Butt Stallion happened differently from how we imagined it would? Furthermore, if Dragonlord's intentions is to rid the Wonderlands free from Tina's control, how meaningful is that really when we are the ones imagining him doing it? And why would Dragonlord react to things other characters are saying despite the fact he knows they can't hear him? And why would it matter to him how you go about this story if we're to believe we're the only ones even conceiving of his existence? This whole matter of Dragonlord's own effect on this world could be fixed if Dragonlord was a physical piece on the map that became self-aware, but as far as we're concerned, is only a mental fixture of Tina's imagination. So anything that he ultimately does is meaningless in the campaign, unless we suppose that if he does accomplish his goal, that Tina will become inexorably changed from this campaign experience. It almost makes me think Dragonlord was supposed to be our character we ditched away, or is supposed to be our own inner conflict with free will and choice. But even if that was the case, that would further cause issues with how most of Dragonlord's resentment rests on Tiny Tina and not us. And that he only resents us that we go through the straight and narrow in spite of his best interest for us not to. And beyond the beheading, there isn't much else that Dragonlord perverts in regards to Tina's campaign, and is more or less a busybody to us and her. Shit! When Dragonlord ambushes us with Coil, Kasara has dialogue to account for that, which means Tina had anticipated an ambush, meaning that the Dragonlord we've conceived can't simply be a figment of our imagination. But if he isn't, and harbors these resentments, again, what meaning does a mental psyche like Dragonlord has on upturning the world when Tina is the one presenting us with this very rendition of the Dragonlord? But before I tire myself of all of these confusing questions, let's actually break down the nitty-gritty. So the note-taker notes that we're scared about the campaign were in fact Dragonlord trying to coerce you away or convince you that Tina is up to no good, as he recites a few you found prior word for word. Again, really neat foreshadowing, as I mentioned that some of them seem to take auspicious account into certain things happening, but the issue here is that why couldn't Dragonlord say that himself instead of needing to hide behind the veneer of someone we would be familiar with in another Borderlands game. And let's assume that every person who played Wonderlands has played said game. How would these lines sympathize Dragonlord more so than encourage us to ride the one-track train further along for those who didn't play said game? People would naturally assume the note-taker is some mysterious third entity not related to Dragonlord. In fact, people would naturally assume Tina was the one who put those notes there, not Dragonlord, given she's the bunker master. As for Tina's depiction, her saying that she only plays the bunker master when Valentine offers her a chance to play in the campaign he's making is foreshadowed here, as she declares to the note-taker in a huff that she'll make the campaigns where only the heroes win, as it plays into her immaturity as a teenager and insecurities in losing control of anything, even minute, in a life of hers that has been nothing but uncontrollable. Other lines of hers, like being appreciative of having a friend since she hasn't had any, or that everyone she knew before died, is great callbacks to both her origins in Borderlands 2 and of the lines she says throughout Wonderlands about not wanting to be lonely again and wanting attachments to others. So there's really no complaints here with her depiction. Maybe the 180 flip on her disposition towards the note-taker was a bit rushed, but we can get to that resolution of that later on. As for her connection to Dragonlord when she said, "He's bad, but not that bad," that line was twofold, as it was both a way for her to justify dragging the campaign of fighting Dragonlord as long as she did, and plays into her own nostalgic appreciation of a character she wanted so desperately to be the good guy. It is interesting how Dragonlord has constantly throughout loathed the notion of being made the villain by a choice he didn't make, which wound up him doing the very villainous things that plays into the story Tiny Tina wants. I do wonder if part of his own psyche is contradicting itself because some part of it is wrestling with Tina's own desires to have the archetypal villain you slay at the end, or that Dragonlord is unwittingly saying about his own fate as much as he desires to rid of it. It is partly why, in spite of how many problems this cutscene does present, I can't help but admire Dragonlord in some regard. In a way, a inverse to Handsome Jack, where instead of deluding themselves into being perceived as a hero, Dragonlord lambasts being pigeonholed into the villain and wants his villainy self-determined. As for the final slice of the cutscene, I do find it weak how all our character has to say about all of this is something about how you still have a choice to defy evil, which Dragonlord rips a line that Jessica Rabbit says to retort, which ends the cutscene and effectively ends this chapter. A lack of input on the Fatemaker's part could be in part to the writers not wanting to go against how we interpret these scenes and letting us come to our own conclusions, but given these characters have already said things that are contradictory to how we feel about it, really, this isn't a valid excuse. There isn't any pause or hesitation in the Fatemaker's breath about all of this, or even a question as to whether they think any of this is happening. As far as the D&D experience goes, it's just taken for granted, like it was always supposed to be this way. It could even play into my theory before that the Fatemaker is just hallucinating these exchanges with Dragonlord, which is why they spare no expense or shock at seeing them, but that is also assuming there was more brain cells in the writing room when they made these exchanges. Or maybe this also plays into the nature of fate, that our protagonist will careless proceed in spite of how many before us took the same path, that nothing Dragonlord said or did would deter us. No. The simplest reason is almost always the exact reason, that this is a first-person shooter first, and a RPG second, or maybe even last, that linearity was always the core that took center stage, so the player character has to have as little exchange as possible as to account for multiple nuances. The Bethesda solution to choices in practice. Why do you think there isn't any explanation or reason as to why we're also trapped underground with these three bozos who decide not only to take down arms considering the violent nature of the Borderlands universe, but decide to play a game with people who would be strangers to us? Because there wasn't ever a reason needed to facilitate the D&D experience given to us in the first place, which ultimately means our exchanges with Dragonlord is just as futile as our own conception of him as real. We're just as much as real as he is, so why should it matter that what we do in the game? And I sincerely don't think the writers intended for that to be the case, but they've effectively made our player character a figment of our imagination too in the D&D world, since they have no glue to tie them to the Borderlands universe in any meaningful way. All of this is very much expressed in how silent we are when the Dragonlord espouses at us, or when Fred and Valentine have their bickering, or when the entire party is at each other's throats. Not a peep. As I said, this decision to have our character be someone who presumably has their own autonomy would have a knock-on effect on the story in a bad way. And yet, we've still just a little more to get through. Let's make fate with this, shall we? So after being given the revelation about Dragonlord has resigned himself to what the Fatemaker intends. Although with that in mind, Dragonlord will still try to plead to the Fatemaker his intentions are noble, even if perplexing what I already said prior about how this would even work conceptually. Once entering the base of the pyramid, while preliminarily getting the shortcut around Ossibol, Dragonlord continues to wax poetic about his connection to Tiny Tina, saying that
I am because of her. I was her. I know her joy, her fear, her wonder, because I felt it for myself. She threw me away, but I still remember.
Which you can really feel the anguish Dragonlord feels when he mentions all this, that he has had to endure it while being discarded ingloriously. However, this once again feeds into the idea that Dragonlord is some kind of inner conscience, or even alter ego of Tiny Tina that is trying to wrench itself free from her clutches, or assume control of her subliminally or otherwise. Whether what he accomplishes here has anything to do with that, or is simply trying to find independence in a world of which he can dictate for himself his own destiny, is left to the cutting room floor, because of all the nuances about what that implies is something the writers are not even remotely capable of tackling. Like what you did with the quartz back in Thy Bard with a Vengeance, a slurry of quartz are left for you to destroy to disrupt the Dragonlord channeling more soul energy into the Sword of Souls. As you proceed to do your quest, Dragonlord chimes in that for every time a hero does slay him, he basically resets the cycle of fighting against another faceless Fatemaker, and that this time will be the last. This is both important to understand why Dragonlord is so wanting to undo the cycle via the Sword of Souls, and how mechanically Dragonlord should work within the conception of the Wonderlands. This doesn't explain, however, that for every rebirth that the Dragonlord still inherits the memories of his last lives, unless again that because the Dragonlord is a visage of Tiny Tina's own hangups and weaknesses that he can't forget, unlike the various NPCs throughout. Speaking of which, regarding how nascent Dragonlord's impact on changing the story has been, I've also noticed a lack of engagement between he and the various NPCs throughout, as the only ones he ever has are extremely quick and tenuous at best. First with Paladin Mike when he slays Butt Stallion, and the dialogue Kasara mentions when he throws Coil upon you, and a third that will also address that happens a bit later. It either further emboldens my theory, as flawed as it is, that our conception of Dragonlord is completely made up considering how indisposed he is to the other NPCs, or that Tiny Tina deliberately made Dragonlord this dispossessed because she holds Dragonlord in higher regard than the NPCs she's made around this campaign in particular. Further muddying the waters of Dragonlord's own sense of control is that he pleads to the Fatemaker that he's trying to make a new world outside of her grasp, in a way freeing you as well from her clutches, which given what Dragonlord is to Tiny Tina means that a portion of Tiny Tina's conscience would literally fade into memory, or that Dragonlord can somehow change the mental confines of Tiny Tina in a way more palatable for him? I mean, rest assured, none of what Dragonlord is saying is anything Tiny Tina would intend for him to say, unless Tiny Tina is doing some extreme reverse psychology with how she is trying to undo her own status quo on the world. And as Dragonlord tries to unravel the fictional story our fictional protagonist has gleamed into is more of him biting more of the hands that feed this story, as he states that the line, "Fate brings us together," was something Tiny Tina stole off the EchoNet, which we likely would have figured given her conception of Paladin Mike was a character she borrowed from Lorelei from said EchoNet, but also this undoes the narrative through line of multiple characters saying it, including our own, regarding the nature of fate being predetermined but not necessarily cynical. I get that in this instance the Dragonlord isn't just trying to make a joke at the expense of an important narrative moment, but regardless, him saying that while the writers have drilled that line several times means they don't take much heart to it. Or that it being so lampshade is supposed to be commentary on how our own fate has been fixed from the very start. But the problem again comes from how much of what the villain is saying we should be agreeing with or not, and whether doing so comes at the cost of the story you're trying to tell. In spite of you having destroyed most of the quartz around the pyramid, there is still more thwacking to do. There's a peculiar exchange that takes place between Dragonlord and Tiny Tina when you enter the Soul Collection Nexus, in which they say,
"That device isn't even important."
Whoops, that's not right. Weird. Actually, the Dragonlord seems terrified of you destroying the device.
Minions, protect that device at all costs. Wait, how'd you do that? Why do I care about this stupid thing?
So, if I'm hearing this right, Tiny Tina presumably went through her notes regarding the significance of this nexus and noticed a incongruity with what she had written it to be over what she decided it was in this moment. Or, if we're to take it to a more insane degree, Tiny Tina literally had a lapse of Dragonlord taking control of what this Soul Collection Nexus entails and decided, nah, it's much more than that. I could be wrong, but even if the first evaluation is correct, that means Dragonlord does have some tangible effect on the real world, if that tangibility is as insignificant as changing the written notes that Tiny Tina has written. But is Dragonlord himself writing it, or is he controlling Tiny Tina for her to write it for him? Regardless, from this we also see how Tiny Tina wrestles back control in Dragonlord, as he has to protect it in spite of him fighting against that urge. This is further evidenced by how once you do destroy the Nexus, Tiny Tina reveals that the Nexus was the soul of Bernadette, a lost love of Dragonlord's that he was trying to revive, to which Dragonlord struggles against saying as such, while giving further proof of how much she treats him like a puppet. This is all well and good until Tina literally states that Dragonlord is absorbing all the soul energy into the Sword of Souls, and Dragonlord just says that verbatim back at you, not realizing how he's playing right into her hands, which causes further confusion that Tina is partially aware of what Dragonlord intends to do with the Sword of Souls, but thinks the reasons differ from his? That's the best faith interpretation of that exchange, but that makes a lot of what Dragonlord said prior about his intentions to use the Sword of Souls further perplexing, as we still don't know what Dragonlord said is made aware of by the entire party in question, or just being said to you, the only person who can presumably hear him. This is basically the same problem regarding the Echo and how certain characters are selectively aware of things other characters said about them or what other characters have done out of their periphery, but this is even worse by saying that when convenient, a character decides to assume the role of another character in order for this dynamic that Tiny Tina and Dragonlord share to make any tangible sense. Otherwise, we have to assume that everything Dragonlord said leading up to Chapter 3 was intended by Tiny Tina and the rest are not. But we know that's not the case, as there are plenty of things Dragonlord says unbecoming of Tiny Tina reciting it to you prior to the end of Chapter 3. Unless, again, Tiny Tina just has this strange vendetta out against you that Valentine and Fred are just completely unawares to. Anyhow, Dragonlord's pleas get more desperate and are more firmly directed at Tiny Tina, expecting a response out of her, despite him literally stating they can't hear him. Of course, he gets no response, which we get a somber delivery from him as he awaits your predictable arrival, in a way knowing nothing will ultimately change. maybe I am reading a bit too hard from these lines, but it does seem Dragonlord has in some way realized that his effort is hopelessly fruitless, and maybe even that absorbing the soul energy into the Sword of Souls is just another story beat Tiny Tina has molded for him. Again, I can't help but feel sorry for the guy, even in spite of his entire conception and train of thought regarding predetermination has been extremely rocky as of late, because I think anyone can naturally sympathize with the idea of having a sense of individuality and free will and not having everything set before you. And with that, we head to the climactic battle against Dragonlord, who opts in to make his own entrance, unlike the prior bosses that Tiny Tina would. Again, maybe I'm getting much more out of this than what the cutscene would imply, but Dragonlord being able to conjure the book Tina uses to showcase a boss mean that he has control over whatever the book is written in it? Is that how he'll carve a world out of Tiny Tina's control, by having her write one for him? Well, regardless, for it being the final boss, it is quite challenging, but not so much that it comes off as unfair. And even if it did, if no one's got my back, I know Thunder Anima's got my back. And after all that you've been through to get to this moment, you finally defeat him, but not slay him yet, as it was implied by him and by the beginning that only the Sword of Souls can kill him in this campaign. One of the last cutscenes play out, which of course this time I will summarize and scrutinize afterwards. Dejected, Dragonlord is now at your mercy, admonishing how he was trying to save you from this fated appeal to Tiny Tina's campaign. You hold the Sword of Souls precariously in your hand as Tiny Tina and the gang loom above you like titans, curious what your next move will be. Dragonlord knows what should happen next, as he even pries his neck outward to give you a clean shot. Our Fatemaker says the eponymous line oft heard of throughout, and casts the sword outward, as a beam of light projects such that even the party recoil by its blinding light. Presumably from doing this, the Fatemaker has chosen not to kill Dragonlord and used its power to resurrect Butt Stallion, also presumably at the cost of wielding said sword, and we hard cut to the real world where Tina commemorates our natural affinity for playing bunkers and badasses for having brought back Butt Stallion where Tina didn't think of before. The team figure we can pick this campaign up again, to which Tina says we can do so right now, which presumably Valentine and Fred do, in spite of Fred's insistence they should get back to fixing their ship to do whatever the fuck it was prior to all this. And thus cuts to the end credits of the game, but that doesn't mean it's the end of this story, nor the end of this series, not by a long shot. So let's break down what we've witnessed to. So again, in spite of how that phrase is mocked and ridiculed throughout it, regardless serves as the close to this arc of predetermination that fate is not so fixed, and that we can make our own destiny, including to spare the Dragonlord's life. Of course, from this does make me wonder what Tiny Tina and the gang think of your decision, yet they seem more transfixed with you bringing Butt Stallion back to life more than anything. Which of course they would, as Butt Stallion is a constant staple of the patented Borderlands humor, and they couldn't really commit to killing said character, despite that Butt Stallion serves more like a symbolic gesture of Tiny Tina's control over the Wonderlands, rather than a narrative piece of said universe. I know that saying that the joke regarding Butt Stallion being overplayed will have me deemed a blasphemer by the respected Borderlands community, but honestly, it's only so amusing that characters will regard Butt Stallion with such grace and elegance with 100% sincerity, in spite of how ridiculous a name that character has, when Butt Stallion was just a one-off comment Handsome Jack made, which was presumably improvised by Damian Clark when reciting, back in Borderlands 2, dragged to its logical endpoint. Speaking of Borderlands 2, there's other callbacks that will be made apparent after the cutscene, but going on. The Dragonlord's lines do seem to be recognized by the party above, as he says, "I know what will happen," and the party looks down upon him. So again, are they aware of literally anything else he said about you or about Tiny Tina? Or are they just hard at hearing for important character beats present? Especially given we have to assume Tiny Tina is reciting these lines and Dragonlord says those lines without Tiny Tina speaking them, meaning he's saying them completely independent of her forethought on it. So shouldn't that strike the party as curious? As for the Fatemaker, I suppose it is a humble choice for us to essentially sacrifice a sword, assuming that is what happened, in order for such a power to not be put into the wrong hands, and as a way to break the cycle that Dragonlord has been trapped in, although that does get a bit undercut when you can get the weapon for yourself as a drop from Dragonlord, but I guess you have to make some concessions for the sake of gameplay and for the sake of an admittedly cool looking sword. and I feel this sentiment of sparing Dragonlord will also undercut some of his motivations afterwards, but we can discuss that very soon. After skipping the credits, we talk to Dragonlord, who is perplexed as to why you spared him, to which the Fatemaker gives some vague answer about how they saw a world divided and that no one should have to be alone, even for the worst of the worst. In the clarity of having been spared, Dragonlord posits that he might still be a part of her story when he thought she all but discarded him from being her Fatemaker, while also not sure what to do now his future is more uncertain, exactly the thing he wanted to accomplish. There's an exchange between him and Buttstallion that goes about as much as you expect, but to be honest, I'm not sure if I like how quickly Dragonlord's disposition turns on a dime, as I feel he has basically accepted the status quo by apologizing to Buttstallion for killing her and is attempting to destroy her world, when his entire modus operandi up to this point was disrupting it in place of something new. I would figure he would be somewhat reticent to accept this random act of mercy, or at least be reluctant to accept maybe Tiny Tina still holds value in him, but still, it is nice that Dragonlord, out of all the villains in the Borderlands series, gets a redemption arc, as he feels the most deserving of one. Buttstallion consigns Dragonlord to 2 centuries of imprisonment in the castle, which is foreshadowing for something else later we'll discuss in the epilogue. Regardless, there's another loot cache down the bottom of where we chopped off from, which also gives us the final note-taker log we can listen to, although this one is less of a monologue and more of a hidden exchange between the note-taker and Tiny Tina. And I might as well play this exchange unbothered for posterity.
Look at this place. You've been busy, Tina. This cave is almost cozy.
Oh, this is nothing. I got plans, baby. Gonna be bombs and hot babes everywhere.
Is this a tea set? Mind if I sit down?
No. Do not sit there. It's, that seat is reserved.
Right. Look, Tina, I came by to say I'm sorry. I hope I didn't ruin bunkers and badasses for you.
Oh, that? I already forgot about that. Yeah. Why? Do you want to play?
You know, I can't right now. Being the leader of an army is more work than I thought. But once things are better, yeah, come on, we'll play. I promise.
All right. Well, we're gonna do my campaign. I've been working on something.
I can't wait to see that. You know what? You're gonna make a great bunker master. I know it.
And if that scroll, as well as all the other hints I've been drip feeding, haven't been enough for you, the note-taker was none other than Roland from Borderlands 2, lines of which were recited presumably before he became the leader of the Crimson Raiders and had even got started on forming an army to fight Handsome Jack in the first place. Also, considering what Tiny Tina said about having started a campaign, means that canonically the campaign we just did would have predated the campaign done in the Assault on Dragon Keep DLC. Although that causes issues, as Dragonlord does mention the Handsome Sorcerer as having been present on the Wonderlands before he did, although with that I just chalk it up to Tina and her copium of dealing with Roland's death made the Assault on Dragon Keep story first. Regardless, this is a touching scene that feels a tension regarding their exchange that Dragonlord shared with us earlier, although I think it's odd how Roland apologizes to Tina for ruining bunkers and badasses for her when, if anything, Tina is the one who should be apologizing for how pouty she was about making an evil decision in her campaign. As for the realization that the note-taker is Roland, assuming that didn't pass by you that Marcus Lloyd, the voice actor for Roland, is the voice of the note-taker, means that Dragonlord's attempt to coerce you away from Tiny Tina using these scrolls is even more dumb, considering we are more familiar with Roland than he, and that Tiny Tina has a established relationship with Roland as a sort of father figure to her. Then again, maybe they were in his voice, but Tiny Tina transmuted it to sound like Roland, as she has a fondness for him and has control over this narrative. But unfortunately, that's just me writing the script for the writers. Still, it is sad to see that Tiny Tina was stolen the chance to play a proper game of bunkers and badasses with Roland before his untimely death to make amends. Even as far beyond as scoring boss loot and other hastily drawn circles known as character arcs is that, of course, we still haven't been knighted. I'm sure Paladin Mike is grateful to get to be part of the story in any way again, harkening back to Lorelei's despair at having been cast aside in spite of how much the developers insisted she'd have a greater hold on the story than implied. There isn't much to say about this whole section, as it's just Paladin Mike blowing smoke up your ass as a procession of fireworks and cheering commemorate your efforts, while Bud Stallion properly knights you without Dragonlord's intrusion this time. And that was for more or less the entirety of the Wonderlands story, open and shut. But we have just a little bit more to discuss regarding the epilogue section, as I feel it's important to convey just how much this game shot out of the collective stratosphere of the audience's interest and what else it implies with its characters further going. So all that's left of the story is to drip feed what is basically the endgame content of Wonderlands. Starting off, your tutorialize and re-rolling enchantments on your weapons, which is basically the feature of re-rolling anointments that was added in Borderlands 3, renamed for effect. Of course, in order to do this, you need to spend moon orb to do so, and how do we get those? Well, you'll see. Second is to go to Izzy's Fizzies to also learn about changing your chosen profession, which is Wonderlands speak for respecting your character, as is the vernacular of the Borderlands games. And if you didn't think that Wonderlands could somehow undermine and undercut the main arc of Dragonlord's awareness of this being all a fake, this exchange Izzy gives you should prove otherwise.
Oh sure, don't you worry. We're all just part of a game, right? Saw you talking to those terrifying sky giants and figured it out. I'm actually relieved. Means I'm not to blame for my sins. I'm a dream thing. The blood on my hands is no more real than the shadows on the wall.
Normally when it comes to any other joke in Wonderlands that falls flat, I could just groan and move on, but here, no. This is an absolute offense at the very prospect of what Dragonlord had gone through in his entire claim to freedom, that some insignificant NPC would just somehow gain awareness by pure observation alone. And let's also assume that Izzy is indeed saying this and not Tiny Tina saying it for her. What does it mean for an NPC to truly be independent if someone else is saying you are? I don't even care that the story is effectively over by this point. This has lasting implications on the whole of this universe and makes it seem what Dragonlord went through was novice in retrospect. And what does this add other than that Izzy might be a bit tizzy when it comes to her existence being flimsy? This is exactly what I mean when all desperation to make a joke can come at the expense of the story you're trying to tell, with this one exchange that should imply any other character we've come across can have a Buzz Lightyear moment but somehow don't, either that Tiny Tina is suppressing them or that they are too pea-brained to look up. And yet, it somehow gets worse from here as far as the game's longevity goes. Bud Stallion whinnies, to which Paladin Mike is apprehensive of her suggesting us to go to the chamber, that being the Chaos Chamber, where you'll come across Dragonlord as per his exile here. According to him, there was a reason why Bud Stallion sent him here, as he now serves as a sort of guide introducing you to the Chaos Chambers henceforth. In essence, these Chaos Chambers are a lot like the Nephilim Rifts in Diablo 3, where you would go kill a procession of enemies in procedural dungeons in tiers, and the tiers can be changed or lengthened depending on your circumstances. There's modifiers you can grab as you go through, similarly to the modifiers in the Mayhem levels from Borderlands 3 that will increase the amount of moon orbs you can acquire depending on their difficulty. While on the surface, this is a great way to placate to the core gameplay loop and to acquire endgame loot easier, as at the end there are these bunnies in which you can expend your orbs to pull said endgame loot, but in practice and over time, it's very clear why these Chaos Chambers exist. They basically only exist to pad out the perceived game time of this game, as its campaign story is severely dwarfed in measure, as I alluded to in how Chapter 5 was come and go, and how even the campaign had to stifle your progress arbitrarily, doing the very procedural dungeons it would eventually have you do for an infinity. Now, of course, you're probably asking, what does this have to do with the game's story quality? And you'll be right to say it doesn't. But the greater point I'm emphasizing here is that Wonderlands has almost no inherent replay value to go back and witness the story beats, as inevitably you will spend a majority of your time metaphorically climbing an infinite wall of difficulty via the Chaos Dungeons. Even Borderlands 3, for as bad as it was, allowed you to re-experience its drivel while utilizing the modifiers in the Mayhem levels to change up what would be an otherwise droll experience. But the moment you complete the Wonderlands campaign, there is no inherent reason to go back to any of the other locations you've come across. The only reason you would is to pick up the lucky dice to increase your passive luck chance, which is also a horrible design choice as of now, and was even worse when you had to do it for every character you made, because going back to these locations had nothing to do with enjoying the scenery, engaging in more side quests, and the like. It was all just to make the Chaos Chambers just that much more bearable, and it is with that is why even consistent Borderlands content creators like Jolt's Dude and Killer6 don't even bother doing runs for the game. It also goes to show that all those shortcuts I just mentioned weren't there for convenience sake, but actually to ignore the very prospect of exploring the various well-designed areas in a meaningful way. To put in perspective when it comes to me, I have bought every DLC for every mainline Borderlands game except for Wonderlands. Yes, even Borderlands 3. For as awful and belly-aching as that story was, the gameplay loop was excellent, and the modifiers could change up the experience, including the DLCs from character to character. In Wonderlands, not only was the DLC provided for that game almost committing highway robbery for how lax they were in new content, but even doing them wouldn't net you anything that the Chaos Chambers couldn't. In Borderlands 2, there was reason to retread areas to farm particular bosses for dedicated drops. Of course there was world drops too, but that's besides the point. And there wasn't a single place where you could get all the gear you ever want that you had to beat your head against the wall for. So why would I even bother playing the DLC of Wonderlands to get the aforementioned new legendaries if the Chaos Chambers will give me just that and then some? And that's assuming I want to do 18 million more Chaos runs before the heat death of the universe, which I fucking don't. But that is a microcosm of the philosophy behind live service games, that you need as many hours played regardless if those hours are fun, and that were deliberately buffered with arbitrary difficulty curves that gets me worried about whatever direction Borderlands 4 takes its story and gameplay further. But let's get the story implications of this back on track. So Dragonlord, in spite of getting a brief redemption arc, has somehow suffered a fate worse than death from the likes of the Calypsos and Handsome Jack. Instead of being made the central antagonist of the Wonderlands, he's downgraded to glorified quest giver who lives or dies depending on your own interest in doing said Chaos Chambers. Now, that's not to say that he likely will be an antagonist again when Tiny Tina dusts off the campaign for another go, but for now he lives in perpetuity for our sake and nothing more. Which comes off as a complete betrayal of what he was trying to do up to Chapter 11, that he wanted to be his own person and now has relegated himself a slave to handing out our Nephilim rifts like Kanai did. I suppose you can say there couldn't be much else he could do given that we, the Fatemaker, spared him, and that if he went about his merry way doing evil things again would also be comically cliche, but if he was going to be made into a fucking ticket eater, then maybe I would have preferred if we just killed him. And that, boys and girls, Z's and they's, was and were's, is the entire story of Wonderlands front to back. It hobbles its way to being only slightly above the pre-sequel in terms of quality, only by virtue of it not retconning story beats in Borderlands 2 to be made worse with the proper context allotted. It also rises above the pre-sequel by having a much more compelling and sympathetic antagonist in it, even if Zarpedon is fairly alright if we ignore her convenience regarding the nature of the vault on Elpis. What fails Wonderlands in regards to its story beats is both that it half measures the supposed themes of predeterminism and fate, as well as having no conveyance to explore what Dragonlord is capable of. As for exploring its other arcs, they are dashed away as quickly as they are introduced, like with Fret and Valentine having a back and forth, Tina's insecurities and immaturity as being the bunker master, or exploring the player character's own conflict with destiny and choice in and out of this D&D experience. And the D&D experience itself is merely a vessel of all the same notes and measures you would expect of one, with not much else to shake them up, nor even any real glue to bring them all together. With areas whimsically isolated and absent from the broader stakes at hand, they might as well have been separate worlds you explored like you did with Borderlands 3, although at least Wonderlands has much more physical tangibility with its universe. It all culminates in a game that, by design, was supposed to be a more realized version of the Assault on Dragon Keep DLC, as that was largely heralded as the community's most favorite to play, but it ends up becoming a DLC of Borderlands 3 itself, sold at full price with nary half of the things that were present in it. No sprites, No dice roll chests, no seasonal events, no dwarves, no orcs, no raid bosses, no takedown events, etc., etc. But before we finally close the book on this, let's do something a bit different with how I've prior summarized these stories. With as few characters that we do have fleshed out, as the NPC characters in the campaign are pretty one note save for a few, I can go over my thoughts on them, that being Fret, Valentine, Dragonlord, Tiny Tina, and the Fatemaker themselves, in order of least screen time to most screen time. Neck and neck for least is of course Fret and Valentine, who in spite of being the only new characters of Borderlands outside of D&D experience, have about as much depth in it as water in a teaspoon. As far as we can glean from their interactions, they are bounty hunters or possibly smugglers who crashed your ship on Pandora somewhere close to where Tiny Tina was hiding. Supposedly from this revelation, they aren't in much of a hurry to get back to what they were doing, as they seem utterly enchanted by playing this game with a girl who they've no clue as to whom. What's funny is that when I first saw the trailer for this game, I assumed that Fret was Gordy's from Tales from the Borderlands, and that we'd have some insight into those characters from this game, but oh how foolish and optimistic I was to think they would. Valentine is characterized as the stupid guy with the good looks who wants to view himself as higher than his current standing, again, as little as we do get from it. And Fret seems to be like any robot with a dab of personality programmed into it, routinely concerned in the calculus of everything as well as mindless violence, which is expressed in what she's most interested in said campaign. A sorely missed opportunity Wonderlands took away was having them physically interact with the Wonderlands instead of being the equivalent of couch quarterbacks, as they would allow them to flesh insight into their characters and the character they choose to play in the D&D campaign, but doing so would have to completely overhaul a lot of the dialogue Dragonlord shares to you, as well as certain story beats, like choosing the diss during the Bag of Bones chapter, or when they are at their throats in the Emotion of the Ocean chapter. Ultimately, these characters are a product of your familiarity with Andy Samberg and Wanda Sykes as comedy actors, and not characters who happen to share those voices, and I would not be surprised if and when Borderlands 4 comes, they are also quickly forgotten for convenience sake. Next is Tiny Tina, the only legacy character out of the lot we're endured to throughout this campaign. Out of all, however, Tiny Tina is perhaps the one that comes off the most unscathed. In fact, certain revelations enhance other story beats prior, like realizing she had the opportunity to make amends to Roland by playing a campaign with him before he got killed in Borderlands 2. While I've already expressed how much I don't care much for her OMG lol so random commentary and dictation reaching its fever pitch through Wonderlands, I know ultimately that's a matter of acquired taste and nothing objectively wrong with her as a character. The only qualms I have with her is more thoroughly exploring her potential flaws rather than having them only be excised for one chapter and one chapter alone, as well as making a more foundational bridge between her and Dragonlord, but we can discuss Dragonlord's character when we get there. She stays consistent through both her improvisation of the campaign, her insecurities about feeling alone, and immaturity of having PG-13 level humor, a bit of an irony considering Wonderlands is the only mainline title rated teen. Second most foundational is Dragonlord, the central antagonist to us and to Tiny Tina. He is by far the most sympathetic of the villains we've come across in the Borderlands series, as he isn't trying to accomplish his goal for selfish reasons, and that his grief comes from having his own destiny stolen from him. As much as I can praise a lot of his descriptions about how Tiny Tina perverts this world with ignorance rather than malice, the main failings of Dragonlord come from the writer's own inability to conceive of his power level. As much as the real stakes are laid in place after Chapter 3, I've still no clue as to what it means for a fictional character in someone's own head being able to create a world outside of it, or if he can even accomplish it by what he describes. And his conceptions of being real to us are more marred by how the player character, the Fatemaker, can supposedly only hear and interact with him in any way that isn't tenuous or circumstantial to Tiny Tina's campaign, when it would have seriously benefited the story and the stakes if we had an inkling as to what the respective party was made aware of. Still, in spite of all of that, I come out of it with high regard for Dragonlord as a tragic character, and Will Arnett, in spite of being typecast for more comedy roles than serious ones, really does give Dragonlord that cutting edge needed to forgive the writer's own failings. And finally, of course, is the Fatemaker. Now, I know it's a bit strange for me to describe the player character as their own character, since even according to this game, we are playing whoever we want to create, but the problem is, the Fatemaker is ultimately the character the writers want to make. That's the only way any concessions they make regarding when the Fatemaker is noticeably silent for character moments between Fret, Valentine, Tiny Tina, or Dragonlord can make sense, that the writers have written a steadfast, confident, proactive person who can never break character when the character can't break character when they were always that character in and out of the campaign experience. An utter deceit of having us believe we were playing a more RPG-focused first-person shooter when the main RPG slice is of the hero skill points and the more varied customization options afforded to us. There's no defying the very campaign given to us, no means to somehow team up with Dragonlord, no means to play a lawful evil type. The game was rigged from the start. We were always destined to play this campaign exactly this way. This may well tie into one of the major themes of this game as well, but I think this is a compromise the writers made and not something they took into account, as there are slight deviations in dialogue depending on what voice pack you chose, but ultimately all follow the straight and narrow regardless. And I would be fine with all of this if they didn't start the gambit assuming you could roleplay this game any which way you could, or mislead people with trailers with 4 presumably predefined characters only to pull the rug from out under us when it came to prime time. I didn't have these same expectations going into Borderlands 2 or 3, for example, but like with the pre-sequel, it's important not to put your own foot in your mouth with promises your ass can't cash like it did with its moral ambiguity. Here, Wonderlands fails to sell the very notion of playing a role-playing game in a first-person shooter setting with how the Fatemaker is predefined from the start. Which, of course, segues us into the themes of the story, which there is only one strong theme carried throughout. Fate, predeterminism, choice, whatever you decide to call it are prescient throughout the Wonderlands, but whether they're truly explored is another thing. As I said, this theme is better explored through Dragonlord than really the player character, when it should be both. As I already described, our player character is setting their own fate unwittingly or otherwise. But seen as Tiny Tina's disposition towards us is merely guiding our hand along rather than forcing it along, only through Dragonlord does this really get elaborated. But again, if Dragonlord's entire conception is made in the player character's mind, or merely interpreted to us through Tiny Tina, that sentiment of engaging in predeterminism rings hollow, even if you can posit that that is the point of Wonderlands, that in our own defying of fate, we make it ourselves. But the game also doesn't have any tact to explore that subtext meaningfully, and only stumbles upon it by accident, like how Tiny Tina states that Dragonlord is absorbing all the soul energy into the sword, and Dragonlord himself saying that almost word for word right after. Whatever the circumstance of relaying this theme by accident is a result of the writers being an idiot savant, I don't give credit for writers saying something they didn't intend in their writing and only being made aware of that fact afterwards. So unless those DLCs do go in greater detail, the theme of Fate Present is utterly borked in the main game. So what else do I have to say about Wonderlands at this point? It was a mainline title that died almost as quickly as it came, becoming, as I feared during my analysis of the pre-sequel, a repeat of it in a number of ways. You'd even be right to forget that there was 2 mainline titles released in 2022, the other being New Tales from the Borderlands, which also came like a fart in the wind, although for good fucking reason, which doesn't spell great longevity for the Borderlands series as of late, even with a supposed live-action movie on the horizon. It's a crying shame, really, since Wonderlands is a noted improvement in its story despite how much it fails its theme and conceptions of the antagonist, although again, that is by virtue of not tarnishing what came before it and largely being disconnected from the main whole of the Borderlands continuity. Which isn't exactly a high bar of good writing that you decide not to piss on the legacies of your past, but given what we've been subjected to when it comes to modern media, maybe that is the high bar now. While Borderlands 3 was the pinnacle moment for when this series started to show chinks in the armor, Wonderlands for me will always be the breakpoint for the life expectancy of this series, the solo to its The Last Jedi, if you will, that it has lost a lot of what kept people coming back and being reinvigorated in the world of Borderlands, that it will never recover if it continues to oversaturate itself as a husk of what it used to be, what it used to hold a candle towards. And that is it. This project took considerably more time than the other mainline Borderlands titles to make, both that I wanted to make this one even more elaborate than last by adding my own flair of chapter breaks and transitions, and that about 2 months prior to this being released, I had broken my hand and had to put the project on hiatus, as well as some of the other longer videos I put out that didn't require much effort of both my hands to make, did distract me from getting back on to this project. Seeing that you've made it this far in my rambling about a dead game, I figure you want to know what the next mainline Borderlands title I'll cover is. As much as it might amuse you to see me physically torture myself to judge through new Tales from the Borderlands, I want to cover Tales from the Borderlands next, as a sort of way to endure the calm before the storm, as well as be able to make comparisons to what fetid parallels new Tales makes with old Tales. I'm also interested in tackling the illusion of choice characteristic of Telltale games, given they solely contributed to the writing of Tales, just to see how much its story deviates, and may prove an interesting challenge for me to tackle the main nuances of its story with that in mind. As with the prior analyses, all citations of the videos I've borrowed will be on the pinned comment of this video in order of appearance. And if you really want to support me, I do have a Patreon with a minimum and maximum donation of $5. And I should emphasize that this is in no way a means to get exclusive content, but more to show your gratitude of everything that I have made and will be making in future. I'm glad you've made it this far, and if you've watched the other videos I've made on the other Borderlands series, I hope you'll be just excited to watch when that video on Tales does enter your YouTube feed. Have a nice day!